Good morning and good afternoon. Just to let you know that we are now live, but I'm going to give us just a few moments for more participants to join in. So it's now 2 minutes after the hour, and we will begin, let's say, in another 2 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to this capacity building event for the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly. This event has been organized by Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future in collaboration with the Civil Society Unit at the United Nations Environment Program. I'm Charles Newhan, Chairman of Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future, and your host today from New York. I'm also joined by our presenters, Jan Gustav Standenes, who joins us from Oslo, Norway, and Felix Dodds, who at the moment is joining us from Iceland. Jan Gustav and Felix are senior advisors to Stakeholder Forum. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Stakeholder Forum, we are an international not-for-profit NGO that has, for more than 25 years, been working to advance sustainable development at all levels. Stakeholder Forum seeks to provide a bridge between those who have a stake in sustainable development and the international forums where decisions are made in their name. Now, before we get properly started, just a little bit of housekeeping to attend to. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on the Stakeholder Forum YouTube channel. In that recording, by way of a link to the SF YouTube page and a copy of the presentation will be posted on the Stakeholder Forum website soon afterwards. As you will see, all attendee cameras and microphones are muted, and they will remain that way throughout the webinar. There will be 2 sessions with 4 and 3 modules respectively, each followed by a 10-minute question and answer period. And there will be a 15-minute comfort break in between the 2 sessions. Please note that if we do not need time for all of the questions, we'll move on to the following module. Please also note that questions should be submitted into the Q&A window, not into the chat window. We'll certainly be monitoring the chat window, but it would be a bit easier for us to please put your questions in the Q&A window. You're also welcome to scroll through the questions and upvote questions, and that way we will know if there's a particular momentum for particular questions for us to answer. And it will let us select the correct speaker to answer that question. Apologies in advance for not being able to answer all questions due to time constraints, but we certainly will try to do so. Now, I'll begin by introducing today's presenters. The first presenter today will be Jan Gustav Standenes. Jan Gustav began working with the UN on environment and governance in the 1970s. He has been lecturing about the UN for 20 years, worked for NGOs at the United Nations in New York during the Commission on Sustainable Development years, and has carried out multiple assignments for the United Nations Environment Program. Earlier in his career, Jan Gustav worked as a diplomat for Norway's Foreign Office in Botswana and Uganda, and later he directed a large aid and environment NGO in Norway for 2 decades. Felix Dodds is an adjunct professor and a senior affiliate at the Water Institute at the Environmental Science and Engineering at the University of North Carolina in the United States. He was also an associate fellow at the TELUS Institute, and he is the co-director of the 2018 and 2014 Nexus Conferences on Water, Food, Energy, and Climate at UNC. Felix is also a prolific author on the subject of global sustainability and was the executive director of Stakeholder Forum from 1992 until 2012. Now on to our presentations. Please welcome Jan Gustav and Felix. Jan Gustav will deliver the first module. Jan Gustav, please activate your camera and microphone, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you for your kind invitation. And I guess we keep our cameras moving, despite the fact that we've had some glitches in the internet, but we'll keep it on.
Yes, we'll keep it on for now, and then we'll deal with that a little bit later.
Okay, very good. So yes, thank you very much. I will go through quite a lot of these of the elements that pertains to the UNEA 5, which will take place in Nairobi next year, end of February and beginning of March. And let us go to the first slide so we can get things going. Again, this is ours, yes, being introduced here. And this is the agenda. As you see, the session will try to make sense of the UN Environment Assembly and UNEP. We will also have advice for newcomers on how to engage with the diplomatic sphere of intergovernmental meetings, guidance on effective use for virtual platforms, and the medium-term strategy, which is one of the most important things that UNEP and UNEA deals with at the moment. And in the second session, we will also talk about the SECSI resolution 73333, which has a very important content on strengthening environmental governance and law. We will be looking at pending resolutions that will be decided on or negotiated at least in UNEA 5.2 next year. And we'll look at progress on UNEP 50 and Stockholm plus 50 processes. So next slide, please. The first module, understanding the United Nations Environment Assembly. And the UNEA, as it is called, is one of the governing bodies of UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, which is headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya. It's led by a senior management team chaired by the executive director, whose name is Ingrid Anderson. We'll see a picture of her in a little while. And we also will see and take you through how UNEP works through its divisions, regional liaison, posters, and different subcommittees, and how they all relate to developing the UN Environment Programme we have today and its extensive work. Next slide, please. When we're going to go into a UN body, an organization, be that a specialized agency or a subsidiary body of ECOSOC or with UNEP as a program under the aegis of the General Assembly, we need to understand its management structure. Only when we know these things can we be effective as lobbyists or advocates. It has an executive office on the leadership level and 8 main divisions: a communications division, an economy division, ecosystems division, law division, science division, policy and program, corporate services, and governance affairs office. And then it has 6 regional offices, which is interesting because if you are a bit familiar with the UN history, we know that the UN has 5 economic regions, but UNEP has 6 regional offices. One in Africa, Asia and the Pacific, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, North America, and West Asia. And if you're looking for where you want to have civil society, it is under the Governance Affairs Office. Next, please. Coming up here slowly, you see some of the key UNEP staff, and we've chosen a few ones just to give you a vivid picture of the dedicated people who work there. We have Ingrid Anderson, the executive director of UNEP, Joyce Msua, who's the deputy. We have Legia Norona, appointed as now UNEP Assistant Secretary General and head of the New York office, a very important position. Ulf Björnholm is acting director of the Governance Affairs Office. Tim Castens, Program and Policy Division. Arnold Huber, Law Division. Susan Gardner, Director of Ecosystems Division. And Sheila Agarwal Khan, Director of the Economy Division. And of course, there are more division heads because we don't have time or space for all of them. But if you go to UNEP on website, you will see them all and find out about their background. Next, please. Now, I have often been asked by people who come to me and said, UNEP is a specialized agency of the UN, isn't it? And it's not. It's not a specialized agency on par with ILO, FAO, UNESCO, and these specialized agencies. Some also think that UNEP is a subsidiary body of ECOSOC, and it is not. As you see here, this is a very general organogram showing all the different bodies and elements under the UN General Assembly. And you can see that they relate to and report to the UN General Assembly through its various committees. As we know, there are 5 standing committees. You got a few subsidiary organs. We do not find UNEP there, but under funds and programs, we find, as we've underlined, UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. And they share this space with UNDP, UNCDF, UN Volunteers, Habitat, Population Fund, UNICEF, and the World Food Program. And this is important to remember because it bears down on how we understand formalities and what we can use as leverage when we are going to be either advocates for a certain program or an issue we want to present, or when we want to make sure that civil society has a role in UNEP. It does have a role. We'll come back to that a little bit later, because UNEP was actually the first UN body to allow civil society and stakeholders, non-state stakeholders, to address plenaries on a regular basis. This is what they did back in 1972 when UNEP was founded. And this organogram, short and sweet as it is important to bear in mind. And of course, at the very far, you have other elements, research, training, and other entities. And they work under the aegis of the Secretary General. And as such, the staff is also part of the Secretary General staff in the Secretariat in New York. Next, please. This particular structure means, as I said here, that UNEP presents the outcome report from UNEA to the GA's second committee. This is important because, and it's often confusing to understand this, but this is a result of, I would say, creative organizational thinking and getting the UN out of deadlocks again sometimes. And as I said, in reality, the last sentence on the first bullet point here, in reality, the decisions means that UNEA decisions are not binding for UN charter bodies unless the General Assembly, ECOSOC, have adopted them. And this is important to remember. And then in 2012, in Rio 20, the outcome report called The Future We Want recommended that the General Assembly establish the UN Environment Assembly. This was found in paragraph 88 of the outcome report from Rio 20. It also said it has to respect the original structure and mandate from 1972, which has been upgraded a couple of times. And then in the resolution 67-251, named Change of Designation of the Governing Council of the UN Environment Program, following recommendations by the Governing Council, agreed to the designation, the UN Environment Assembly, and which is important, it has universal membership. Now, the Governing Council was the earlier international global governance body for UNEP. Now, these are tricky things to understand, perhaps, but they are important things to remember when we are going to promote, for instance, resolutions or have ideas that we would like to have on the agenda. Next, please. In addition to the UN Environment Assembly, there are 2 governing bodies, the Bureau elected by UNEA and the Bureau of the Committee of the Permanent Representatives, which is often or most often referred to as the CPR. The Bureau is elected by UNEA for a 2-year period, according to a geographical representation of its members. You find this in every UN body. The geographical representation also ensures a fairness between all the member states. The Bureau of CPR is elected by the permanent representatives from the embassies posted in Nairobi. At the moment, there are 122 such embassies. And the 2 bureaus, and bear in mind that the bureaus here are spelled with an X. It's not a misprint, but it's plural for bureaus. They meet frequently during the period between the UNEAs and other sort of policy directive bodies and the governance bodies of UNEP. And this is important also to keep in mind. Next, please. I apologize a little bit for my coughing, but I have a regular bacterial-based flu or cold, and that's why I'm a bit bothered by that. This is just a very simple organogram again of UNEP and UNEA. We said universal membership, 193 members, meets biannually on uneven years. That's a bit of a hiccup there because of the pandemic, but I'll come back and explain that. Concludes with a 2-day high-level segment, is supported by the Bureau, and which has 10 members, and the CPR, as I said, missions accredited to UNEP now 122 members, and the Bureau has 5 members. And then there are very important committees, which is listed 5 areas here, and we'll come back to them and put them in a workable context as we go on. Next, please. Now, UNEA normally meets every 2 years, but now we are preparing you for the second part of UNEA 5, and it's called UNEA 5.2. Now, UNEA is the central governing body of UNEP, has a universal membership, as repeated, and its functions are setting priorities for global environmental policy. We'll see how that plays out later. Advising UN system environmental policy issues. We'll also come back to that. It'll be identifying new environmental challenges and examining existing practices. And the fact that it has this mandate to identify environmental challenges is often overlooked. It's produced tremendously important and well-researched reports. We'll come back to those. It organizes dialogues with the major groups and other stakeholders, the so-called non-state actors. And it promotes partnerships on the environment, and it makes a lot of efforts to mobilize resources. Next, please. Coming up here, slowly, is another picture of one of the plenaries, one of these big rooms. And we now go to the Committee of Permanent Representatives. The CPR, a subsidiary body of the UNEA, monitors the work of UNEP between UNEA, advises UNEA, stimulates program-related discussions, and the CPR with representatives from capitals and now also stakeholder groups hold preparatory meetings every 2 years in the run-up to the UNEA session. The CPR was earlier close to civil society or to the major groups and non-state stakeholders, but a couple of years back, UNEP, one might say, relented or realized the importance of including non-state stakeholders into their sessions. Of course, we have no voting rights. No non-state actor has a voting right at the UN, regardless of where in the UN you are, but we have speaking rights, which is very, very important at an intergovernmental meeting. Next, please. The CPR prepares with the Bureau meetings of UNEA and has regular reviews on implementation of its decisions. And we've listed here a few of the sort of key issues. And if you go into, again, this well-populated websites of UNEP, you'll find details under each of these. Composed, as I said already a number of times, of accredited permanent representatives at UNEP. It says circa 100 here, but it's 122. It's a five-member bureau elected for 2 years. And each bureau member represents one of the 5 UN regional groups of member states, and not the 6 UNEP regions. Again, there is an interesting finesse here. It has to meet at least 4 times a year, and they also have a very big meeting with the bureau. Now, because of the pandemic, the CPR and the bureau have been forced to meet more often than has been usual. Sorry. And as I said earlier, major groups and non-state stakeholders may also participate in these meetings as observers. Then you have the important open-ended Committee of Permanent Representatives, referred to as the OECPR. And that is, you could say, a preparatory meeting to really go into the nitty-gritty elements of the UNEA, and it meets just prior to the UNEA. We'll come back to that. So in large letters, the CPR shall contribute to the agenda of UNEA, even though the agenda is sort of a table set thing, but the content is important. And of course, adding new themes to the agenda under the regular blueprint. Provide advice on policy, prepare decisions and convene thematic or programmatic debates. And these debates are now a regular feature of the UNEAs because you have the so-called leadership dialogues, and we'll come back to that later as well. Next, please. We found the pictures of the esteemed members of the Bureau of the CPR. Luisa Fragoso, the chair, is the ambassador of Portugal. The vice chair is Mrs. Selma Malika Haddadi, ambassador of Algeria. Another vice chair is Mr. Erasmo Roberto Martinez, ambassador from Mexico. Vice chair is also the permanent representative of Estonia, Mr. Ada Lomus, and a very important position, the rapporteur is held by the ambassador of Pakistan to Kenya, Mrs. Saklain Saida. And next, please, picture slide. And we go to the UNEA Bureau, which is elected by the UNEA, and of course also the composition is according to this geographical distribution. Has 10 members. Standard practice is to support the president of UNEA and of the Bureau in preparing it, draft a ministerial declaration, and of course also represent the Bureau at relevant international environmental conferences. Right here you have former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Ms. Helen Clark, and two-time executive director of UNDP addressing the plenary at the General Assembly. Next slide, please. The Bureau shall, and they also have a mandate and a drawn-up portfolio to carry out tasks entrusted to it by the Environment Assembly. So the interaction here is very, very, very important. Assist the president, as I said, review credentials, very important, prepare sessions for the assembly, and provide guidance for the selection of the overarching theme for the assembly. This is an interesting thing because to get to the present title of UNEA, which we'll come back to, there's been a bit of a discussion between the Bureau and the members, the permanent members of the universal members of UNEP. I'll come back to that in a little while because to me it was an interesting debate. So the Bureau doesn't always have its say. Next slide, please. Further, the Bureau must advise and provide input to UNEA, consider negotiations and facilitate negotiations for draft resolutions. It's a very important thing, which Felix will come back to. Recommend allocation of items to subsidiary bodies of assembly. I mean, dishing out the work, basically, after the UNEA is over. Provide with CPR guidance on relevant meetings and ensure coherence and complementarity. Next slide, please. And this is the Bureau itself. The new president who will be chairing the assembly is Mr. Espen Barth Eide, newly elected Minister of Environment and Climate in Norway, is the minister there. There's an interesting situation in Norway that has caused this because between UNEA 5.1 and UNEA 5.2, Norway has had parliamentary elections, and the government that was in power during UNEA 5.1 was ousted, and the new coalition government has come in, and they now will provide a new Minister of Environment, and he will become the president of UNEA. Acting president, until this is formally adopted, is Mrs. Bérengère Abba, the vice president and secretary of state for the biodiversity of France. And you have other important Bureau members, vice president, Minister of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica, Andrea Meza Murillo. You have Dr. Mohammed bin Dainaf, vice president and chief executive of the Supreme Council for Environment of Bahrain. Mr. Reggie Nelson, ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary of Suriname. And there are 5 more. Next slide, please. Irina Vujovic, Vice President, as well, Minister of Environment and Protection of Serbia. Tönnis Mulder, Vice President, Minister of Climate and Environment of Estonia, he was just appointed. Lakshmi Devanti, Vice President and Advisor to the Minister of Environment and Forestry in Indonesia. Simeon Sabadogo, Vice President and Minister of Green Economy and Climate Change of Burkina Faso. And again, one of the more important positions, because she has the task of being the rapporteur, Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fishery of the Republic of South Africa, Mrs. Barbara Creasy. So these are people, and we present them to you so you can remember them. And if you go to Nairobi during UNEA 5.2, you might address these people. They are approachable, as most people are in these meetings. Next slide, please. So we need to go back because in my position as a senior advisor in Stakeholder Forum, I get a lot of emails, and often I get this question: why was UNEA 5 divided into two sections? And of course, the simple question is the pandemic. But we'll take you through this. Next slide, please. And I guess it's coming. Yes. Now, this is what UNEP stated in 2020 with the support of the Bureau and the CPO, taking into account the exceptional circumstances, COVID-19, and decided to convene online a UNEA 5.2 session. Now, the interesting thing is that the proper UNEA, according to the rules and regulations and the formalities of UN, lasts 5 days. So first, UNEA 5.1, which took place this year in February, was 2 days. And then you have 3 days to go, which will take place February and March next year. Together, they make 5 years. And then they already hoped for an in-person meeting, provided the pandemic allows. And this is what they're working towards next year. Now, some of you may have seen that UNEA 5.2 actually extends into 5 days. But the UNEA 5.2 is only 3 days, and it's followed by a special session on UNEP 50, and we'll come back to that later and explain this issue. Next slide, please. Now, there were practical consequences of the decision to split UNEA 5.2. And the practical consequences were that they had a real important job to do. They needed to decide on a budget and a program of work. And that's why they needed to hold this meeting online. It was imperative, but I also cut down on the agenda. So the total agenda of UNEA 5.1, which took place in February this year, was an abbreviated agenda, even though they had to look at the complete agenda. We'll see that in a second. And then they said, well, we won't deal with all of them. We'll deal with a few points, few agenda points this time, and then we'll do the next one there on UNEA 5.2. And the most important things were consideration and approval of a medium-term strategy for the period 2022 to 25, a program of work based on that, and a budget for the period. And this was also decided. Then they had an online leadership dialogue. We'll just refer to that also quickly. And then perhaps the most important elements that needed to be dealt with online was the resolution 73333 on the Global Pact for the Environment, as it was once called, UNEP 50, which takes place next year, and Stockholm plus 50. Next slide, please. The open-ended Committee of Permanent Representatives met from the 15th to the 19th of February, preparing for UNEA 5.2. Now, believe me, the meeting room, which is usually packed like this, was empty. But people were online, and of course, they were doing quite a good job. UNEP had a formidable task to put 190 countries together. Now, not that many participated, actually. We'll see that. Next slide, please. We had only 92 member states that participated actively during the open-ended Committee of Permanent Representatives preparing UNEA, but we also had 27 representatives from various major groups and non-state stakeholders. So it was a fair amount, but it was the most important thing that it was a quorum. So it was a legal meeting. Next, please. The provisional agenda looks like this, and it's more or less the same system or the same blueprint every year. But and then, of course, it has to be adopted to themes that are important. We can have the next slide right away, because this goes from 1 to 8, and there are 9 to 16. I'm sorry about that. And and then, of course, they realized that on a 2-day level, on online, they couldn't cover all the details, and also negotiations, as we are used to when people deliberate and they go into committee meetings and do that. That was extremely difficult to carry out in an online meeting. So next slide, please, if I may. So they decided on the organizational work, which is one of the first items, to say, please, we will deal with just a new number of these items. And then I listed them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12, and 15. And then, of course, the participants accepted this. And so the remaining elements will be dealt with next year under UNEA 5.2. And I would say that listening to the participants, they clearly understood the challenges, and they were quick to adopt to an online modality. So from my point of view, I was very impressed with what took place on the internet these days. Next, please. And we come to a question and answer on what we've said so far. And Charles, this is where you sort of steer the discussion.
Yeah, well, what I would say is we don't have any questions in the Q&A box at the moment, so I would encourage our participants to think about some questions, and please put them in. In the meantime, I'm going to invite Felix in. Felix, you can try starting your video, and if that is problematic, then you can just go to audio. Just wondering, while we're waiting for some questions, is it possible that you might want to make a comment or two about that presentation?
No, I think Jan Gustav covered most things. I'm not that keen on negotiating through the internet. I don't think it works. And I attended the 3-week Bonn preparatory meeting for Glasgow. And you can't negotiate when you don't build relationships with the member states. And so I think you can do dialogues. That's a really good space for it, because that's a great opportunity for lots of people to be engaged. But when it's getting down to, as we'll discuss today, the resolutions, I think it's pretty clear that you can't do that. And I was following the agriculture negotiations for the Glasgow COP, and we had at the preparatory meeting in Bonn in June only 10 governments. So Jan Gustav did very well with 92 governments. We had 10 governments engaged in the agriculture negotiations. And that showed when we came to trying to get a decision in Glasgow, where in fact everything was passed on to Bonn next year. There was basically just a summary of workshops that they had held, because they did not have the time to work, and something like 20% of the people had changed. And so it was very difficult, I think, in certain cases.
Thank you, Felix. There's a question now in the box. Jan Gustav, what are the dates for UNEA 6? Do we have any sense of that yet?
Yes. It is. It's UNEA 6. Sorry, UNEA 6.
Yes.
It's no. The dates are not yet decided. It's in 2024 though, because they jump here now to synthesize and sympathize the sequence. So there's a bit of a an up and down here.
I didn't interpret it that way. I interpreted it that it would have to happen before March 2024. It could happen in December 2023 if they wanted to. So I think they've left themselves more flexibility in that context. Of course, the problem that they suffer from is that they have no meeting beyond this to input to the midterm review of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think is a mistake. And I think that there needs to be an environment ministers meeting sometime in 2023 before the SDGs are discussed. But I mean, whether we can persuade UNEP to host one of those, I don't know.
Okay, thank you for that, Felix. Let's see. Well, there's a question. Do you mean 5.2 instead of 6?
No, 5.2 is
Yeah.
next year. 6 is at the moment,
Yeah.
before February 2024.
Okay, thank you. There's another document. Another question. If you guys have access to the Q&A, why don't you have a look at it? There's a question now from Deborah Rowe. If you could take a look at it, one of you be so kind as to answer that.
I don't know.
So that there's a listing of, I think, the Committee of Permanent Representatives. So I'm not sure that it includes their emails, but it might do, which you could circulate to. And the Committee of Permanent Representatives will meet the week before UNEA. And so if you want to circulate it through the representatives, I guess that's what you could do. We're not discussing green jobs at UNEA 5.2. It's not on the agenda at the moment. I mean, there could be an emergency resolution. But you might be able to talk to Alexander Duras to see if he could circulate something to the missions in Nairobi on your behalf. I don't know. What do you think, Gustav?
That I would say that that's possibly the right way to do it, to write to Alexander Duras, who's the chief of civil society, and see if that is a possibility. Because I know that the UN in general is very reluctant to give up their listservs for a number of reasons. I think the poor participants or delegates would be flooded. But there are distribution possibilities when the OSCPR and the UNEA is in session. If we should have had written UNEA 6, then of course that is wrong. We're talking about UNEA 5.1 and UNEA 5.2. But the UNEA 6 was referred to on the next presidency of UNEA 6, and that goes to Africa. So the special session, which will take place next under UNEA 5.2, back to back, will be under the presidency of the UNEA 6. So maybe that's where it was. I can't remember exactly the phrase. Let me just also comment on what Felix said. I absolutely agree with him that doing negotiations and deliberations online is virtually, I would say, virtually impossible. And if you have the chance to read the dialogue sessions from the UNEA 5.1, and we've accepted this in a report we've made, a synthesized report of the outcome of UNEA 5.1, which is online with Stakeholder Forum. I think every one of these 80 or so statements made during these 2 days said we cannot deliberate or negotiate during an online meeting. This was emphasized by almost every official delegate, and as Felix said, it's fraught with lots of difficulties. And as we who like to observe these things and try to listen with our ears to the ground floor or in the corridors, it's impossible to find what we could call reliable gossip on the internet.
Just to think, Deborah, if it's a UNEP publication, then Alexander should be circulating it anyway. So I think you need to talk to Alexander. It should, if it's a UNEP joint YEA publication, it should go on the UNEP website directly. So I can't believe that you can't talk to Alexander and get an email sent out from his office. So that will be my recommendation.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here with just a couple of answers. The email address for Alexander Duras will be coming up a little bit later when we, in the presentation, as well as some other of his colleagues. The civil society unit always welcomes, stakeholders to reach out to them. And I would say to Deborah and to others, if we're going to share information, which we welcome, I should have said so earlier, please put any shared information into the chat box, because this way your fellow participants will be able to look at it right away. And also we will be saving the chat, and we'll share the relevant information that's in the chat with you when we send you links for other documents. So having said that, I think we're going to move on now. We're keeping pretty good time. Felix, you are next up. I'm going to advance to the next slide, and I will go off. And Gustav, if you would please also go off the videos for a moment, and we'll hand over to Felix. Thank you.
That's fine. Then can we have the next slide, please? So, Charles, I'm not seeing it yet. It's coming. It's gradually arriving. So my part of the discussion is to take you through a little bit more of the lobbying side of the approach to moving forward your issues. And to do that, you need to understand the countries that you're dealing with. And so the European Union works on a 6-month cycle for their presidency. So we have been experiencing during the Glasgow COP, Slovenia as the president. For UNEA 5.2, France will be taking over the presidency. And clearly they have a number of issues that they care about, such as the Global Environment Pact, Global Pact on the Environment. And so I'm sure they will use that position to advance that a little more than they could do perhaps just as a member of the European Union bloc. The group of 77 at the moment, I think, have 134 countries and sometimes include China. And we saw some of the problems within the group of 77 at the Glasgow Climate Summit, where India and China both pushed for the taking out of coal out of the final agreement, the final agreement from the COP. And so there's going to be some serious problems within G77, which will, I think, first emerge when we find ourselves at UNEA 5.2, because that's the next major event that's going to happen on the environment. So that will be interesting to see. Guyana's been the president of G77 during this period, and I'll come back to G77 again because it's not in every part of every UN center that it has got Guyana. Key G77 countries. Now, in negotiations, not everyone participates, and it sometimes depends on an individual who's really engaged, or both positive and negative. But then you also will find that some countries will play more critical roles pretty much in any of the environmental spheres, and there are good reasons for that. So I've listed that some of those countries that I've come across in my engagement at UNEP, or my engagement at the climate negotiations, or at the high-level political forum. And some of them are obvious. So you have, for example, Colombia, because they were the mother of the Sustainable Development Goals, then they feel a kind of responsibility to engage. You have Brazil, who've both hosted Rio and Rio +5, and at least within the civil service, you have Rio +20, you have a really engaged civil service, even if the president at the moment isn't so much engaged. And then in New York, you have the Maldives, have the president of the General Assembly at the moment, and so they will attend UNEA 5.2 as the president of the General Assembly. And then you have others such as South Africa, who played a critical role at UNEP, particularly in the creation of the UN Environment Assembly. It's the same in EU countries. Not everybody engages as much as you would expect them to. So Denmark, many of the Scandinavian countries are engaged and are engaged in a positive way. You will have also clearly France as the president of the EU, but Germany has been a huge advocate on environment throughout the last 25 years. Then you'll have what they call single decision countries. And so if you're engaged at UNEA, to be honest, at that point, it's much better to focus not on the EU, not on G77, unless it's a strong country who will be prepared to speak outside of G77 coordination. But in a 3-day meeting, you really want to focus on single decision countries where you can have a conversation with Norway, or you can have a conversation with New Zealand, or you can have a conversation with Canada, and get them to bring your issue up. And then the other blocks need to then react to it. And of course, Oasis, 43 countries, but clearly in the climate negotiations had to stand down on the issue of loss and damage, and had to stand down in the issue on coal in light of the strong push by China and India. So on the European presidency, as we say, it's a rotation presidency, and it forms a troika between the Commission, the Presidency, and the Council, so that they can coordinate activities. It will have already met sometime in November. It has an idea of what the resolutions are going to be. At least some of them are available for UNEA 5.2, and it will be assigning individual countries within the European Union to lead in collecting views within the Commission. It will also support the engagement of with the European European Union Secretariat, the engagement of their members in the negotiations. And in many cases, the European Union will have, in a sense, responsibility that has been given from their member states to the Union over particular issues. Where that isn't the case, it's a more easy place to influence. If you could move to the next slide. So going back, as I said, to the group of 77, why 77? Well, that was the number of countries that were original signatories of the joint declaration in 1964, and it stayed as that. It was originally established around UNCTAD, which is the UN Conference on Trade and Development. It has chapters in Geneva, New York, Nairobi, and Rome, and also in Vienna and Washington. And as you can see, it has a different country that will be coordinating in Nairobi. So if you go to G77 website, you'll see that it's Malawi who will be coordinating for G77. If you want to ask questions at G77, the email address is there. But it's important to know that it won't be Guyana in the context of that. If we can move to the next slide. I'm about to sneeze, so I apologize for that. Okay. We got over it. Oasis, this is the New York ambassador for Oasis, and he has recently taken over, and he had a particular manifesto that he put forward in the election for the chair of Oasis, where he wanted to amplify their leadership, transition to implementation. So one of the problems with many of the Oasis groups is that even if they want to put in for funding from the EU or from the Green Climate Fund, it's extremely difficult because they don't have the staff to put that together in many cases. And so there's a huge bureaucracy around those funding processes. And so he wants to see more of a collaborative effort between the different islands to do that. And the Alliance of Small Island States has clearly been really active in the context of climate change, and has often been able to, in a sense, raise the issue to something like the Security Council, or being able to at least try and get some of the countries to accede to their requirements at the climate negotiations, which as I said, that didn't succeed this time. We move to the next slide. Next slide, Charles. Okay, next slide. Thanks. There are 4 important reasons why stakeholders engage in the UN. Setting agendas. And so a couple of quick examples of that. It was actually the DPI NGO conference that was held in 2011 in September, after Colombia had first proposed the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals in July 2011. The conference refocused itself around the idea of Sustainable Development Goals and put on the table something like 15 suggestions for SDGs. And because that was a UN conference, even though the conference was for NGOs, those particular suggestions were the only suggestions that were available for governments to consider in the run-up to Rio +20. So clearly setting the agenda. Negotiating outcomes, you know, you were there, Richard Jordan, who's just put that there, and he thinks it was 18. He may be right in that respect. Richard Jordan played a critical role in putting together the document that was then put forward in front of those who attended the conference. Negotiating outcomes are where you want to be engaged to ensure that a particular text will become part of that negotiation, and that happens at different points. So during the SDG negotiations, there'd been a push to try and get antibiotic resistance in as a target. It failed, but in the final document that was agreed the following year, we managed to get some text in on antibiotic resistance, and that was done in the final 2 weeks of the negotiations. So don't give up hope till the very end. You can often do to succeed. Conferring legitimacy, stakeholders came out against the continuation of the Commission on Sustainable Development, and that was a good thing to do. And it closed down and became the high-level political forum. And then we're often implementing solutions. So I think that's really good. So in the context of what Gustav said, you know, the medium-term strategy of UNEP has 3 major themes on chemicals, biodiversity, and climate. This particular UNEA is meant to be looking at biodiversity, and so it's very important to understand what the themes are, both for a particular UNEA, but also to understand that UNEP is now committed to working under these 3 main themes: biodiversity, climate, and chemicals, and we'll be looking to align a lot of its work, both in the resolutions that we'll talk about shortly, but also in the context of their work program. There are opportunities to bring up different issues that fall outside of those, but this is a kind of an attempt by UNEP to move towards more of a clustering of their work around 3 main pillars. You move to the next slide, please. The medium term, so most stakeholders haven't until now engaged in, you know, trying to influence the medium-term strategy, and now it exists. It actually addresses many of the things that stakeholders do care about. But it does offer you an opportunity to then look at the program of work that's underneath it, and to offer the opportunity to work with UNEP in helping to deliver the program of work. So if you are going to engage with UNEP, and we just saw Deborah's example with youth and the green economy, there is a real openness to collaborate to help deliver that. Not enough stakeholders are looking at UNEP as a potential partner in helping to deliver the medium-term strategy and their program of work, much of which will be different NGOs' priorities as well. Yeah, Gustav will go into a little bit more detail on UNEP at 50 and Stockholm at 50 shortly. I'm not going to cover that now because it will be repeated. If we can have the next slide. Charles, next slide. So yeah, you have to be responsible when you're engaged in the UN process, and you may have seen that there were some demonstrations at the Glasgow Climate Summit. Those had been agreed with UN security, so it's not that you can't demonstrate, it's just that you should do it in the context of having discussed that with UN security. And so there is a kind of responsibility code, and we'll come a little bit to that in a different slide. You're at an intergovernmental process, and so you have to respect it. What you do can impact on not just you, but also other stakeholders. So it's important to abide by the rules of procedure. If we could move to the next slide. Next slide. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so these are just a kind of set of things of what not to do, and it kind of that you think they're common sense, but the reason we've put them there is because they haven't been common sense in certain meetings. Don't go up to a government when they're speaking, and you can see that with their light, or if they're about to speak, you can see that their light is red and then green when they speak. Do not sit in a government seat unless you're on the government delegation, or it's a side event at lunchtime. Do not interrupt the meeting. And we saw that in the SDG negotiations, where a couple of individuals who were unhappy with the Iranian government's statement went down and harangued the delegate, and it nearly got everybody kicked out of the meeting. Don't target a government in your intervention. It's not what you do. You talk about it in more general terms. Don't wear inappropriate clothes. And if you're going to do a demonstration, you make sure that you agreed it with UN security. And it's not necessarily a difficult thing to get them to agree. They just want to do that in a way that's recognizing. Don't take a country's flag or name, and we saw this where WWF and Oxfam had done that with Saudi Arabia and then flushed it down the toilet and took a video, and so every stakeholder was basically kicked out of the climate negotiation, and the CEO of both organizations had to come and apologize, and luckily it wasn't pushed to continue exile. We were allowed back in, but with serious warnings. And don't deviate from your message if you happen to represent a major group in your speaking. Next slide. So the major group facilitating committee is the coordinating body. And actually move to the next slide because it's a little bit more useful than this one. There is a handbook that can help you with this. So definitely download it from UNEP. So Charles, put the next slide up. So there are 9 major group recognized at the UN, and that comes from the original Agenda 21 in 1992. And there are, if you read it, you'll find the rights and responsibilities. It's the first time that we recognize that different stakeholders had an engagement. And though we see that the UNEP is called a civil society office, it doesn't act as a civil society office, it acts as a stakeholder office, because if it acted as a civil society office, it wouldn't support business, it wouldn't support scientists and technology people, it wouldn't support trade unions, it wouldn't support indigenous peoples, because these are not part of civil society, they are beyond that. And so UNEP has, underneath it, been very much supportive of that. And you'll have representatives from those, as it said in the previous slide, 2 of them who will be sitting on the facilitating committee, plus regional representatives from the 6 UNEP regions. Next slide. This is just a picture that we have of, because we've tried to personalize this by giving you pictures of people so that it makes it easier for you to go up to them if you happen to be at UNEA. This is the civil society or stakeholder unit. If you could move it to the next slide. And these are the people. We haven't put their emails there. I'm sure that we'll provide Lisa Alexander's email accordingly. But Alexander heads the unit. Letitia is the focal point for Latin America. So you see that they've supported different regions as well. But they also support, so we've worked on this project with Aurora. So different projects which the civil society or stakeholder unit is working on will be assigned to different parts of the team. If you could move to the next slide. So just thought we'd put up some kind of characteristics for what a lobbyist is, a good lobbyist is. So if you're going to be a good lobbyist, you have to like dealing with other people and committing to building relationships and not just pushing your own issue. It's the relationship building that helps you to move your issue forward, and that takes time, it takes energy, and it also is important to understand who the people you're talking to. And remember that they're not the party that's in power, they are the civil service that is supporting that, and often that distinction is important because it helps you to get your issue addressed. Make sure you have a comfortable professional atmosphere with the people you're dealing with. Enjoy coming up, working with them and finding solutions to the problems. Being prepared to think clearly under pressure, and that often is a time pressure where you may have an issue that you want to move forward, but you have to be prepared to give and take, just as governments give and take. You have to develop what your bottom line is, or red line, understand what the governments are, and then work somewhere between that to find something sometimes which may not be your perfect answer, but which definitely moves the issue forward that year. And then you can always come back 2 years later. It's also important always to understand where the other people are coming from, because you need to see that though you are passionate about your issue, they're dealing with a huge agenda and often will be foreign office professionals and not environment professionals. So you can help them to become experts in their area. And you've got to be a good listener. So when you meet them, don't spend all the time talking to them. Spend most of the time listening to what they're saying to you. So both before and during a UNEA meeting, you would try and work out where the different governments are going to be on your issue. If you've been doing it before, you would have been hopefully working with others in capitals. Are they strongly for you, weak, not declared, weak against, strong against? If you're in New York, what's the position of the mission? If you're in Nairobi, as we will be, what's the situation if we're dealing with something that could be dealt with also in FAO or WHO? Make sure that you're aware of what their positions have been in those negotiations as well. Go to the next slide. So draw up your objectives. What do you want to achieve? Make sure that you've researched your position and that you have independent evidence of what you're arguing for that can be put in front of the government. It's not just your viewpoint. Develop a particular policy point. Map out, as we said, what other organizations think of your position. Where possible, work with others, because you can't cover it all yourself. Coalitions are critical to being able to deliver on many of the issues that we care about. Next slide. So, very simple things, all of which are based on things that I've forgotten to do at certain points. Make sure your laptop has wireless. Make sure you bring a memory stick in case you need to transfer stuff and there isn't a wireless link at that particular venue or a very weak one. Make sure you've got a mobile phone. If you come into Nairobi, it might be better to get a SIM card at Nairobi airport so that you're not paying exorbitant prices. In New York and Geneva, there is a blue book which has the names of the missions, the names of the members of the missions. It's not always obvious whether they're following your issue, but you can download that, or I think you can still download it. There is actually, if you go to where I've put that, there is bizarrely, which I only found out a few weeks ago, there is a link to downloading a set of a PDF with the name and addresses of all of the ambassadors in New York. So you can actually email, you can actually send them letters and things. Make sure you come with enough business cards. We've now got phones, so we probably don't need a digital camera, but often it's a little bit less likely that some governments will be happy you taking the picture of them with a phone. They'd be more happy with it being a camera. Next slide. We see a committee of the whole, which is the whole of UNEA, will go down to working groups, which will be groups which will take on responsibility for a number of resolutions. Then you'll go down to contact groups, which will be trying to deal with the resolutions that specific resolutions. Next slide. Friends of the Chair. We saw this in the Glasgow Summit most recently, where you saw actually John Kerry was a friend of the chair of the British government, of Sharma, and was doing a lot of work to support Sharma. So friends of the chair are beyond the bureau. They are people who are either well recognized, well respected, and that you think will help advance your cause, or they're key governments that need to be close to the decision, the overall decision, because if they're not, then there'll be a problem. And we saw that at the Copenhagen COP, where the mistake that one of the mistakes that Obama made was to exclude Sudan, which was then chair of G77, because he thought it was the northern part of Sudan, the one which was a dictatorship, and he didn't appreciate, or his people didn't appreciate, that in New York, Washington, and at the EU, as the country of Sudan was splitting into two, there were two ambassadors, a North and a South, so a Muslim and a Christian. And in the climate negotiations, it was the Christian South that were chairing the G77. And that mistake then played a critical role in the Copenhagen Accord not becoming more than a noted document. So make sure you have the right friends in your group. If you could move to the next slide. I think this is just a repeat, Charles. If you want to move on, you carry on doing this during the negotiations. So have a whole game plan for the negotiations. Detect other groups in your country or region to coordinate with. So make sure that you're working with other stakeholders or governments that support you. Organize before you go several meetings on the issues you care about with your government, because if you turn up and you haven't met them before they come, they're not going to listen to you, because they're going to ask, why didn't you see them before? Brief the media, and I would strongly suggest, if you have the opportunity before UNEA to, with others in your country, get together a media briefing, because there were a number of terrible mistakes the media made during the climate negotiation, one of which was to assume at a very high level on some of the TV programs that because the China and Russian presidents were not there, that the whole of the country was not there. That wasn't true. And I watched a very embarrassing interview with Rachel Kite, where she had to point out to a very well-respected journalist that in fact the Chinese and Russians were both there and were both active. So the media needs to understand the issues. If you can, get a debate in your parliament, and there are a number of ways to do that. set up a rapid response mechanism so that you can try and put pressure in your country on the government over an issue if it looks like it's going the wrong way. And I could give you examples of how we've done that. If you can get some countries will put NGOs on their delegation. Norway, the Scandinavians, the Dutch, the UK used to, I don't think it does now. Canada, these countries, Brazil in the past has put a lot of NGOs on delegations, South Africa. If you can get on the delegation, you have to abide by whatever the government position is, but it helps you enormously to understand the internal workings of their own coordination, which you can then advise in the future on putting together positions. Next slide. I just wanted a picture of Captain America and Thor there, and coffee. You know, when you're at these events, there's a number of things that's very important. One is that if you can work in a coalition, that means you can have floor managers who are in the negotiations, taking notes of what people are saying. While you're not in the negotiations, you've taken governments out to the coffee shop to be able to try and put your viewpoints. When I was engaged with the SDG negotiations, I was very seldom in the room other than to take a government out of the room to lobby them. I didn't need to listen to the negotiations. There were people listening to the negotiations for me who would then tell me what had been said, so that when I met those governments, I was able to cover those issues, whether it was positive or negative. Coffee bar diplomacy is absolutely crucial. Try and go to the ENB website, look back through previous meetings of the UNEA last year online. There'll still be pictures. There'll be pictures from UNEA 4 and from 3. It'll give you the pictures and often the name of the people and their country. If you have a picture gallery and you go into the room and you know what someone looks like, it's a hell of a lot easier to be able to go up and talk to them. So very much do that. Stakeholder Forum used to do that a lot in the negotiations for Rio+20. And I always say to my staff, if you're spending more than 20% of your time with stakeholders and not with governments, then you are clearly, in a sense, not doing your job. So, a summary: know your goals, know the decision-making process in your country. When are they meeting to make their decisions on the UNEA resolutions? Know what level to work at. So, are you going to be working at the national level? Is there a regional meeting that's going to happen? Is there international, so you work at different levels? Know the tools that you can use, parliaments or the media, to help support your issue. Know when to make the position. At the beginning is obviously better, it becomes more difficult as you move forward. Get to know your government officials. You can often meet your ministers for coffee as a UNEA where you would never meet them in your capital. Know who the key UN officials are, know who's going to support you, but also know who's going to be against you, and make sure that you work to try and find out why they're opposing. And if you can, move them. If you can't, well, then isolate them. But know your limits. If you're going to be, this is not a long meeting, UNEA, but yeah, Gustav and I have been in meetings that have been 2 or 3 weeks long, and you just have to pace yourself through. So, poll 1. Why are you thinking of engaging with UNEA 5.2? And here's your opportunity to answer that.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in and say we'll give about 1 minute. If you would please be so kind as to answer the poll, and then we'll share the results with you. We've almost have votes from half of you. If you would all please jump in and vote, that would be greatly appreciated. Okay, I think we've now come to the conclusion of that. And as you can see, there is, sort of almost tied three ways between influencing, holding governments accountable, and learning more about how intergovernmental negotiations work. So we will share those results with you. And in the meantime, I think we'll stop now and we'll move on to the questions and answers that we can ask for Felix. Felix, you have the floor.
I shouldn't have put Morocco in single decision countries, Richard. You're absolutely right. I'm not sure why I did that. I'm just looking. Did you see any questions? That was the only one I saw in the question and answer.
I'll remind our audience, please do, if you have questions, now's a good time to put them in the Q&A box. We'll give it a minute for you to think about that. If there are no further questions, in the meantime, Jan Gustav, if you wish to pop in for a moment, if you want to make any comments about what's been going on, and I will monitor questions and see if anything new comes in.
Now, just emphasize what Felix has said about moving around in the negotiations hall and be respectful of the fact that you're not at a civil society meeting or a non-state stakeholder meeting, but at an intergovernmental meeting. And I have found that once you respect these very basic rules of courtesy and just being nice, there is no end to your opportunities and possibilities. And just one thing that Felix noted on the admin or the staff of Obama's mistake with the South and North Sudan, and also what the media thought that Russia and China wouldn't be present in Glasgow. There was a similar mistake made in Copenhagen when media reporters would say that, and I read this several times from that dramatic meeting when the COP was in Copenhagen, 2009, that we said, and suddenly some of these presidents would go out into the corridors and just chat them and ignore the rest of us. And this is how the UN meeting works, because, the chair may see that three countries are disagreeing, but the disagreements are not that great. So the chair will say, could countries A, B, and C please take this issue and go out into the corridor and sit down and work out the differences between you and then come back in and report. I mean, there's so many basic informality procedures that are being used. So, and to an untrained eye, this is not understood. And of course, to an untrained eye, you won't see the opportunities of such informalities as well. So very important what Felix has just said.
Thank you, Jan Gustav. There are no questions. If one of you or both of you want to make a final comment, if otherwise we'll move on to the next module.
I'm fine.
Yes, I'm fine. I'll just before we go on to the next module, I was quite disturbed about being reminded that we may have made a mistake on the date of UNEA 6. And I had to go back and look at the slide where this comes. And it's correct. It says UNEA 6, but it is showing the agenda, the original agenda, which would have been produced and used in UNEA 5 had that taken place as a regular meeting. But this was agenda point number 11, and that was one of the agenda points that was actually postponed and will be dealt with next year. So agenda point 11 on the dates for UNEA 6 will be discussed next year, and that decision was made in February in the UNEA 5.1. So just to make sure that we've not just been taking all these elements and moving them around at will. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Jan Gustav. Okay, I'll then ask you to turn off your camera and microphone, and we'll move on to the next session, which is going to be presented by me. So I will move on to that. So we're going to talk about the correct use of virtual platforms. Please forgive me for turning away from the camera, but I'm going to be looking at my slides. And we'll do this. We're doing this. It's going to be a brief tutorial. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. But the general idea is that we've been bombarded with so many different platforms over the past almost 2 years now since the COVID pandemic forced all of us inside. And you will be familiar with what are the most common platforms that we've seen through various meetings over the years. They're all very effective and used in different ways by different organizations. For instance, the United Nations tends to use WebEx. They prefer that platform, and big organizations like the UN and others have very large subscriptions in which they have quite big flexibility in order to use the different platforms. But we'll focus on Zoom because we're using Zoom today. And part of what we'll be doing very briefly here is talking about, the basically getting started and what to do, how to get logged in, how to do things correctly. The specifics tend to be common for most of the platforms. So although we'll be focusing on Zoom, generally speaking, I think it's easy to say or fair to say that some of the details are going to be the same for all of them. Of course, in terms of being part of a meeting, the typical Zoom meeting, which is different from a webinar, invites various participants in, and they can participate fully. Microphones activated, cameras activated, and that does, of course, vary a bit depending on what the host is looking to achieve and how big a meeting is. If it's a meeting that's a handful of people or a dozen people where they can easily interact, it's very practical to have everybody open and engaged and on screen. If you're talking about dozens of participants, then it tends to be moderated and individuals are brought in and out as they ask questions or wish to speak. In a webinar, as we're doing today, typically there'll be the panelists, myself and Felix and Jan Gustav, in some cases support staff. For example, we are going to be doing these webinars in Spanish and French translation. They'll be presented in English. There will be translation options. And so the panel will also include the translators. But in the case of a webinar, you are often just a participant, as you are today, microphone and camera not activated. However, we do have the ability to bring you in individually, either audio or video, and that's something to be aware of, that if you are invited in, and that's what we'll go over in a moment in terms of how to activate your cameras and microphones, so that should you be invited to go in and speak, you're familiar with how to do it, and it's quick, so that you're not passed over because of a technical issue. And of course, the final way of doing this, the live stream. So for instance, this is being live streamed on the YouTube, the Stakeholder Forum YouTube channel. And the advantage of that is, should the webinar go over subscription, then if anyone is locked out of registering after the subscription maximum is met, they'll still be able to view it live on YouTube, and the system sends a message to that effect. It will say something along the lines of the webinar is oversubscribed. However, follow this link and you'll be able to watch it live. And this is an example. And what you aren't seeing today, but what you will see if you look at the live stream, is that the speaker tends to be up in the right-hand corner. And that, for instance, is why we learned over the years to modify the PowerPoint so that there's a little space up on the right for the live stream. It doesn't block important content that we want you to see. Now, this is a quick example of what happens when you get a registration email. It's going to be very similar with the other platforms. This happens to be one that I just registered for the other day. This is the top of the message, is what it looks like as it came to me, and then some more of the detail. The important thing to recognize is that you can join either on a computer, tablet, or otherwise with video and audio, or one or the other. But also, if it's just that you have a mobile phone or you're calling in, just having on your phone in a car or in a remote area, there are options to choose that. And if you look at the very bottom, for instance, it says international numbers. Clicking on that will give you numbers that are for your region or country. One important thing is about calendars. You'll notice in the middle of the screen there gives you the option to add the webinar to your calendars. Some don't notice that, some don't do it. Depending on your platform, whether you use Outlook or Google or the iPhone platforms. By adding it to your calendar, it also brings in the links. So right there in your calendar is the link for the event. You don't have to search your emails to find it. Now, let's get into setting up your tech. As you'll see, depending on what you're on, whether it's computer or otherwise, in the left-hand corner, you have your microphone and your video functions. For you today, it will be muted because of the way we're setting things up. However, you do have the option to choose. And one important thing to do is when you go into both microphone and video is to see what your computer system or your phone allows. There'll be multiple choices. This is on my desktop computer, so there are multiple options there. I happen to have a separate microphone, so that's why that one is chosen, because it's more suitable for webinars like this. And the same goes for the video, and making sure you choose the right camera. So in the case of most desktop computers, while they have a built-in or a external camera, your phones, of course, will have an internal camera, as will your laptop. So you generally only have one option, and that should be there by default. But it's good to know where to look for them to make sure that everything's right, so that you're ready to go when you're either asked to speak, or certainly when you're listening, and you have the correct speakers connected. For example, on the left, making sure you have the speakers on your laptop or your desktop computer set up the correct way. And this is the last section, while in the meeting. It's very important. You've been doing this today. Those who didn't join us today will get links, and they'll be able to watch the videos. And for those who aren't so familiar with actually taking part in live events, they'll be able to perhaps better understand how to do it. And again, to be ready, you are able to click on the little box on the left where it says participants. There's a little up arrow. You can then see who's participating, and then you would also have the option of chatting with them individually. The Q&A, of course, I've become familiar with today, but you want to click on that, pose your questions, and also look for questions that might be those that you would like to see the answer to, but didn't think to ask. And in that case, you can upvote them, so that when we see them and we see 3 or 4 people are really keen to know about one particular thing, we'll focus on that when there are multiple questions and maybe limited time. Sharing screen, when you're invited to take part in an event, or if you're a presenter, you're able to, the host will give you the permission to share your screen. And that's what I've been doing today as the host, sharing the slides with you. Of course, you could raise a hand when you are in a meeting, or where you do have a live microphone or camera. Instead of just jumping in and shouting, or necessarily putting up your physical hand, which also works, but by raising your hand, a little icon comes up. The hosts and moderators will see it, and also they'll see in sort of a sequence of whose hand went up first. So out of fairness, who may have asked the question first, they'll be the first ones to get an answer. You'll see the record button. That's typically done by the host, but sometimes the host will give permission for someone else to record an event. Important, and one of the last ones, is interpretation. We don't have interpretation activated for this particular webinar, but when we do the Spanish one and the one in French, you would then click on interpretation, choose the language of your choice. And there will be options in there. And one of the important options is choosing it so that you'll hear the interpretation louder, and the original version, let's say in English, will be at only 20% volume, so that you don't have 100% volume voices overrunning each other. And the more option are things that you wouldn't necessarily be a part of. For instance, one of those options under more is to live stream the event to YouTube, which the host normally does. And that's it. I tried to be as quick as I can because we're running a little bit behind schedule. Let's see if we have any. There are no questions specific to this. Do the guests have any specific questions about these online platforms, or would Felix and Jan Gustav like to share some of their experience and hints, and maybe some disasters that they've seen that could be avoided? Now, Gustav and Felix, do you want to come in at all, or would you are you going to pass on that?
No, I think, I mean, if in my case, any disasters that I have experienced has been made by myself. So I learned the hard way, about 2 years ago, what not to do. and with the help of manuals and your advice, I have not become proficient, but I can handle it, you know. So, but I think what is most important is that it's a vehicle of information and engaging people in themes. But as Felix also pointed out, it's not good for negotiations. The impromptu, the immediate and the spontaneous discussion you need to have to move negotiations forward doesn't allow, internet doesn't allow for that, not yet.
No, thank you. That's a good point. Felix, any comments or any interesting humorous stories for us from your experience? No, Felix is not.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Very good.
I couldn't find my microphone.
You're not paying attention, Felix.
No, I was paying attention. We won't go there.
I'm teasing you. You're just not paying attention to my instructions. That's all.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think all of these new platforms that have evolved, they have a role in the landscape of our work. And clearly, kind of webinars we weren't attending that many webinars before we did close down, but we found this to be a very good way of getting information across. I think that they're great for academic conferences where you can get people who wouldn't be able to go to a conference because they couldn't afford to travel, but actually allow them to participate. I think the Islands Forum is a classic example of this, where you've got people on small islands across the world who now are participating in meetings that they would never have gone to if they had been trying to do it in person. But they're not decision-making processes. They are information exchanges. They are an opportunity to learn. They are an opportunity to share good practice or case studies. So I think this is where they really help, I think.
Thanks, Felix. I just said there's one comment in the chat box, which I think it's important for me to make reference to. Thank you to Catherine Klein. One thing about WebEx, and I find it often the case, and sometimes it might just be one's individual computer, is when you open up a WebEx meeting, you're given the choice to either use the WebEx app or to just do it in the web browser. And sometimes if you choose, one or the other, you get an error message. So it is fair to say that Zoom tends to be a little bit more reliable in the ease to just log in. But I'm not saying that to badmouth WebEx. It's something you need to get used to. So once you've done it a few times, try to remember what the little trick might be to get the WebEx login to work for you. Because it does also ask you for things like your email address and your name, which is a few more steps than Zoom. So when you are going into one of those WebEx meetings, bear in mind, give yourself maybe another extra 5 minutes before the event starts to make sure that you do those little extra steps. And if you run into a glitch, you can be ready for when the event starts. And one more comment, and I say this not as a criticism of my colleagues, but because of the different internet speeds in different parts of the world, when you're involved as a presenter in a webinar and the slides are progressing, sometimes they're lightning fast, sometimes they drag on. So that's where in the pre-meeting, the host and the panelists will discuss some of the potential problems and sort of what to do if this happens or that happens. Well, we're running just about on time. We're a little bit ahead, but I think we're good that way. And so I don't see any more, let me see if there's any more questions in there. Nope. There's a question about advising on funding opportunities to participate physically in meetings. Why don't Felix and Jan Gustav, why don't you, and it's an important question, if you don't mind both jumping in and maybe just giving a quick response to that.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I think there often will be some funding that will be funneled through the major groups facilitating committee to enable participants to come. When we, Jan Gustav and I partly ran the steering committee in New York for the Commission on Sustainable Development, we actively went out to seek funding and put together a travel fund for developing country participation. For developed countries, and in theory, this is North America we're talking about, because this is where we're angling this webinar doesn't mean you are from North America, but that's where it is. It would not be seen as something where there will be support for you to attend. You would have to seek your own support, financial support to do that. But there are often ways of doing that. You can write defending proposals. You can, if you're in a developing country, you can go to places like the British Council to get support. You can go to the missions of Norway, Denmark, or particularly the Scandinavians. If they have an interest in an issue that's coming up, they might be prepared to fund you. But that's really your responsibility in most cases, particularly if you're coming from a developed country.
I just want to add one thing, because I was thinking about that when you were talking about being an NGO and a delegation. I have often been discussing with delegations who have been thinking that they are not obliged to take too many non-state stakeholders on their delegations. I know this was used for my country for many, many years, Norway, saying that we're not only allowed to take 2 non-state stakeholders on our delegations, and the UN doesn't allow more, which is not true. A country can actually accredit as many as they want to under their umbrella. So, and I know the UK was quite, in your time, Felix, very generous in allowing non-state stakeholders, NGO people, civil society to be on the delegation. It doesn't really mean that they paid for their trip, but they allowed them to be part of the delegation. And when I made that point to the Norwegians, they relented and said, I'm sorry, but we thought it was a two-person limit. And if you have money and you can provide your own participation and you are accredited and you come onto the delegation, of course, as Felix said, it gives you some privileges above and beyond meeting access. So this is also something to be aware of. Thank you.
It's a very good point, Gustav. Thank you. Back in the days when I was working with Felix as his deputy director, I was asked to be on the UK delegation, one of the CSDs, maybe CSD 8 or something like that. And it was it was really a great experience, but also the government at the time very receptive to working directly with stakeholders. So they valued the feedback back and forth. It was important, nevertheless, to assure other stakeholders that I hadn't been co-opted by the government, but I was genuinely there as a representative of stakeholders and be able to communicate to the government directly from any of the stakeholder groups. So it is really a very good opportunity if you can develop that strong relationship with your government. Gentlemen, I think considering the time, we should probably move on. And that is, Jan Gustav, you are giving the final selection here. So I will move on to the next slide for you, and I will sign off for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going into the 2 key decisions, or actually 3 decisions made, the obvious decisions made in UNEA 5.1, and focusing on the medium-term strategy. And then in a little while, come back to UNEP 50 and Stockholm plus 50, which are 2 processes now going on and being developed almost as we speak. And then there is a couple of others. Several more issues were also raised during the online meeting UNEA 5.1. And again, this is from the plenary. And unfortunately, the plenary, of course, in Nairobi was empty back in February this year. Next slide, please. Sorry. So the most important thing that they decided on during UNEA 5.1 was the medium-term strategy, the MTS, which is basically the program area for UNEP to work on between 2022 and 2025. And of course, it is important because it outlines the budgetary fund of challenges and also focuses on the on the annual program of work. And the MTS, as Felix alluded to earlier, will address three interconnected crises: the climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And the MTS it's very impressive work how the UN, how UNEP comes up with it, like collaboration between the Secretariat, the CPR and the Bureau, and of course a lot of subcommittees. And this is also where civil society, non-state stakeholders, and major groups can come in at an early stage. I'll just remind you of this, that 2 MTSs ago, we were speaking about 10 years ago, and also including the second to last, the penultimate one, not the last one, UNEP reached out to stakeholders and asked for input. And they asked for input through the accredited non-state stakeholders, and there are about 600 of them at UNEP. And their response from this, I mean, asking the question, what do you think we should prioritize? Which themes are important to you? And the response from the stakeholders at the time was 0. And I think this is a reminder for us to be active, in being active, also looking at what UNEP is communicating to us. So the MTS is UNEP's vision for reversing this trajectory that they actually came up with through analysis, through looking at reports, through looking at issues that have come up over the last 4 or 5 years, and where sort of the sore areas of the environmental problems are. So the focus is the 3 crises they address: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And of course, also, they build on reports, and they build on earlier documentation that the UN has made, UN being member states. And of course, the Rio +20, its outcome document, the future we want. The MTS articulates UNEP's role in delivering on the promise of the 2030 Agenda, the environmental dimension, and supporting countries to deliver on their environmental commitments. So this is also something in the mind of UNEP when they develop their MTS, which I will be using as the abbreviation and not the medium-term strategy. Next slide, please. So a meticulous way of looking at what UNEP is doing, the mandates from earlier UNEAs, because they have given a mandate by earlier UNEAs to deliver on resolutions taken. And to be able to do that, UNEP either establish systematic committees or subcommittees, or they have larger divisions dealing with it. So they did this grid and looking at these correlative issues. This is one of many instruments they use to develop their present MTS. Next slide, please. and then meticulously putting this together. This is, you can go, Charles, and just sequence the whole thing. So you have then the overarching issues. You have a context analysis, strategic focus, vision aligned with the SDGs. They look at outcome maps, the business strategy, and they look at the biennial plans and result-based baselines from earlier, then coming into what's going to happen in the following new years. Just keep pushing the arrows here. You have the second biennial plan and revision based on emerging issues, and then the project portfolio. So it's a meticulous and well put together machinery, which could be said to be very well oiled if countries are meeting their financial promises. Interestingly enough, one of the recurring themes by the leadership dialogues in February this year by the representatives of the different countries, saying that we have actually met our financial obligations. And this was one of the highlights, I think, of the dialogues when the member states said, we've given you the money we promised you. That's not always happened. Next slide, please. So UNEP has a number of ideas and plans, and of course structuring this is important, because when they build the medium-term strategy and they build it together, it must make logical sense in terms of a thematic approach, as well as a structural and organizational approach, as well as making sense in the implementation. And then of course UNEP has to answer to all the other challenges they got. The Secretary General and the member states in New York decide that this decade is going to be the decade of action. They have the overlying responsibility to make sure that UNEP is following up on the environmental dimension of the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., etc. So support an integrated and balanced implementation on the 2030 agenda, one concern, gender responsive program delivery, and many partners, alignment to UNEP's core mandate, transformative change, multiple sustainable development goals, innovative concepts, value for money, delivery on the agenda 2030, recurring theme, using the development system, collective action on environmental sustainability, resilience and environmental risk across all aspects of the UN Charter, South and triangular cooperation, leave no one behind issues. And then they also need to pick up the environmental elements of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And so they're putting all these elements under the broader crisis analysis, which they did, climate stability, zero greenhouse gas. So they take into consideration now adjusting what they have to adjust by what happened in Glasgow. And then living in harmony with nature, where humanity prospers in harmony with nature in a pollution-free planet. These are elements now of this analysis they made. Next one, please. And then to address these crises, UNEP has identified 7 sub-programs consisting of 3 interconnected areas of action, 2 foundational sub-programs, and these are facilitated by 2 enabling programs, and they're listed in a logical way. The interconnected areas of action is climate action, nature action, chemicals, and pollution. Foundational sub-programs supporting this is the science policy interface. UNEP was one of the first organizations or entities within the UN to bring environment and science together already from 1972. This was a mainstay of UNEP. And then environmental governance, which is so important. And as we know now, and I'll come back to that in a little while, that the Human Rights Council has also said that clean environment is a human right. So the governance issue here is important because that also talks about accountability, transparency, and of course, participation of civil society. And then the enabling sub-programs is finance, transformation, enabling sub-program, and the digital transformation. And putting this together demands a lot of work, knowledgeable staff, and of course, money, and then a willing support from countries. And I'm coming back to, I think, which is going to be a major challenge in this UNEA, but I'll wait for this until the very end of this. So next slide, please. They have a 3-pronged delivery approach throughout, excuse me, all of these 7 sub-programs. Coming back to cutting edge science, extremely important. And UNEP is using reliable science to an extent that I think most people will be surprised when they look at what they're doing. They work with relevant partners from science, industry, indigenous peoples, local communities, vulnerable groups, investor community, and other non-governmental sectors and policymakers. And you'll see that UNEP has a tremendous amount of work putting into green investment and banking initiatives, which actually also underpins this. And they work across regions, countries, and sub-national levels. And UNEP was the first one to actually bring a horizontal and vertical approach into this in a mesh. Going back to 1972, the period from 1972 to 1980, this is some of the challenges that UNEP fought for. And I would say to some extent has been successful, but it's only coming into life as we speak. So it takes time to change your mind. Next slide, please. So the 7 sub-programs will support, accelerate, and scale up shift to sustainable consumption. And the consumption and production area is one of the key areas that was given to UNEP by the Rio 20 process, saying that this is a particular mandate for UNEP to work on. So transitions to clean energy, resource efficiency, etc., circularity in the use of energy materials and greenhouse emitting. You see how they now underpin the climate issue. Cleaner production with efficient circular processes, enhanced support for ecosystem-based policies, and restorative and regenerative practices. This is where UNEP also has to respond to other programs that the UN has embarked on, and UNEP also has initiated the regenerative practices and restoration of ecosystems, which is a decade dealing with this. Next, please. They talk about increased advocacy and information sharing and behavioral and educational tools. And of course, everybody speaks about education and the environment, but not everybody implements this. And there is a tendency, I think, among member states and people in general who knows a little bit about the UN, they say, well, education and research, science, that's UNESCO. But no, it's not only UNESCO, it's also the responsibility of UNEP, and they're pushing for this in a very, very formidable way. Then promoting alignment of private finance, sustainability and responsibility and net zero emissions. I said UNEP is pursuing two strands here, banking initiatives and green investment, two very interesting elements that actually challenge the investment idea and talk about new due diligence systems. And of course, trying to make sense out of subsidies. We had that discussion also in Glasgow. Next slide. What is also important in the MTAs is that there is a very vast collaboration with multilateral environmental agreements. The MEAs play a very, very substantial role in providing normative elements to UNEP, but they're also agreements that actually demand implementation. And we'll come back to these MEAs in a couple of minutes. But one MEA which is very interesting to me is the Carpathian Convention, which was developed between 7 countries in Europe. And if you look at the implementation element of the Carpathian Convention and look at what they do and look at the SDGs, you'll find that they're almost the same priorities. And this, when you put all these elements that we've described here together, you have a model of the MTS, where you have the analysis, you have the enabling programs, you have the science work. And it actually makes sense if you just sort of pick it apart like this. And the result of all of this was a result of many, many years of work, negotiations between member states and input from member states and the Secretariat, and also to some extent by civil society. My big challenge to the member states is that will you honor the MTS decisions made last year or this year, next year, and not reopen the discussion and give it even more strength? And that's going to be a challenge because the MTS as such is no longer on the agenda, but there are elements that are parallel to this. Next slide. So, thematic programs relating to the 3 identified crises are you most engaged with? These is a poll, and Charles, this is you administrate this again, I guess.
Yes, over to me. I've launched a poll, so I'll ask our participants to please take a moment and think about your potential participation. I'll give it about a minute or so, and let's see if we can get all of our participants to vote on this. Thank you. That's great. We had a good participation rate, and I suppose in some ways maybe no surprise, considering the critical nature of the climate crisis. That climate action is sort of, by far the most common area where NGOs and non-state stakeholders look to participate. So thank you very much for doing that. Let us now move on, and we're now at the Q&A section, which will then be followed by a bit of a break for everyone. So I'll ask Felix and Jan Gustav to please, in particular Jan Gustav, as you just presented this section, to please come on. There are no questions at the moment in the Q&A box. So I would ask the participants to think about, take a moment and consider whether you have any questions regarding that very important section on the medium-term strategy. In the meantime, Felix and Jan Gustav, would you care to make any comments while we wait for questions?
Well, I think I have my comment, which I've been repeating so many years after these UN conferences. I keep saying or commenting and saying that the outcome decisions only last in the memory of the people as far as the airport. I'm a bit too cynical to say that, but when organizations approached me and said, what can we do for UNEP and what can we do in the context of UNEP's work, I would say study the MTS. This is what Felix talked about earlier also when the engagement comes, and look at what part of the MTS your organization either already plays or can play. And so there is a very, we did when I was with an organization called ANPID 15 years ago, we found out that our members in the former Soviet Union states and Eastern Europe were very negative to the UN system on environment, including UNEP itself. And the governments in these countries were also very negative to civil society. That also had a governance element to it. But when we started to conduct and see what the NGOs and non-state stakeholders in these countries were doing, and looking at what the priorities of the countries were trying to implement what UNEP was doing, we found the correlation was amazingly high, and they didn't know of each other. So when we had held a conference in Tajikistan between the East European and former Soviet Union-based organizations and the government, they were amazed at seeing how close they were actually prioritizing environmental challenges. And so this is often the case. I mean, but then, and I think to some extent now, the reason why they didn't communicate was, once, of course, one feels the opposition necessary to a government, but also the fact that they didn't read what the governments or UNEP was doing. So communication and understanding this is some of the challenges here.
Thank you, Jan Gustav. Felix, again, no questions at the moment. Would you like to make a couple of comments before we go to the break?
Just a small thing on the UNEP Finance Initiative. Many of you will have noticed the launch of the Green Finance Sector Net Zero Coalition led by Mark Carney, the former Bank of England head, during the climate negotiations. That is built on the work that UNEP has done. It's basically underneath it, it has the UNEP principles of responsible investment, the principles for responsible insurers, and the responsible for bankers. And so those that have signed up for the green, the 130 trillion that you saw being quoted, are in essence the work that UNEP FI has done over 20 years under Paul Clement Hunt, under Steve Stone, and now under Eric Usher, to bring to the table a whole group of finance institutions who now have a framework to be able to make that commitment. Whether that commitment turns out to be greenwash or whether it turns out to be real will depend on what kind of accountability, independent accountability mechanism can be set up to judge that. But underneath it, that's the work that UNEP FI has quietly been doing behind the scenes, which most people weren't aware of, and which was an area where people could have engaged, and very few did.
Thank you, Felix. Any final comments from you, Jan Gustav, before we take a break?
No, only that the second session after the break will be dealing with more the nitty-gritty and concrete stuff that will be dealt with, the resolution proposed, etc., the themes of UNEA 5.2, as well as Stockholm 50, UNEP 50, and the 7333 and the consequences that may have for environmental governance. So, as they say, stay with us, don't go away.
Well, thank you, Jan Gustav and Felix, for that very, very rich content. So what I will say now is to our guests, We're going to go silent for a few moments, but we'll still be live. We will be back at 15 minutes after the hour, so everyone can have a comfort break. And do please stay with us. We will see you soon. Thank you. Hello, we will resume in about 2 minutes, just to let you know that we are still here.
I am here as well.
Apologies for that. It seems I've dropped out there for a moment. Let's get on with the presentations now. Felix and Jan Gustav, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Good. Are you seeing my shared screen?
I do.
I am.
Very good. Well, in that case, welcome back, everyone. Sorry for that little glitch. As we are often, we see every once in a while, these things drop out on us. But for now, we will begin the next session. That will be presented by Jan Gustav. And Jan Gustav.
Yes. Just give me the slide. And next one.
Okay. Oh, another poll.
Well, that's you, Charles.
Yep, I just want to make sure you were seeing it.
I am. How many multilateral environmental agreements exist?
Good. If you bear with me, I will go on to that one. Okay, everyone. This is a little bit of quiz to which I believe Jan Gustav has the answer. So if you could take just a moment and please, we'll give a minute for you to please contribute your thoughts. Just one more request for those of you who have yet. Don't be afraid. There's no Well, I suppose there's a right answer, but don't be bashful. Please put your best guess, and then Gustav will go into some detail on that.
No grades.
As we can see, we have the sort of a tie between 10 plus and 1,250 plus. Young Gustav, do you want to say a few words on that? And then we'll move on to the next bit.
Yes, it's way above 1250. So those who guess that are of course right. It depends on how you define the MEAs. There's always a bit of discussion, legal discussion and finesse there, but for a long time, I know the number of MEAs stood at somewhat above 750, and then it has increased. And what we fail to understand or fail to remember is that the MEAs also often are an agreement between two countries. So I mentioned earlier one example of a regional convention, the Carpathian Convention between 7 countries. Then you have the Alpine Convention, also in Europe, between the countries that belong to the Alpine region. So when you take all these elements into consideration, you understand why the number of the MEAs is way, way above 1250. But as there is no sort of definite definition, 1250 plus would be the correct answer.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide.
Yes. Now, this leads up to the resolution 73333, and it has a small history. And as a historian, I, of course, like to pull the perspectives here. It was launched in June 2017, and there was a text on an initiative, a global pact for the environment, which is written by, as you see, more than 100 environmental law experts in more than 40 countries. And one of the friends of, I guess there are someone who do not see anything on the screen, Charles. The French president, Macron, was made aware of this, and he presented the idea. Sorry, here we are, suddenly without any slides. And we're back again. So this is Macron presenting the idea of the Global Pact for the Environment back in 2018. And as I said, there is a legal background to this, and the legality and the initiative came from France. Since then, I would like to say that France's passionate interest has waned a little bit, but it's been picked up now by a number of other countries, and it has also been made into a process within the UN, as we shall see. The next slide, please. The General Assembly accepts this idea and adopts the Global Pact for the Environment into a resolution called 72277. Now, the first number before the slash, the 72 here marks the 72nd General Assembly, beginning with the first one back in 1945. Now, they established an ad hoc open-ended working group with 2 co-chairs, Amali Moudalali from Lebanon and Francesco Duarte Lopez from Portugal. And they've had 4 substantive meetings, 3 in Nairobi. And as we speak right now, there is a meeting or a conference or a set of deliberations taking place in Nairobi these days on the 72 or 277, or as it is now called 73333. It has become also an ECOSOC process, and this is where the formalities becomes a little bit muddled, but I hope to straighten this out for you. Next slide will show us how this evolves. Almost from day one, civil society took a great interest in this, or the non-state stakeholders, and these people who are pictured here, 98% of those are people with a lawyerly or law background. So this provided the non-state stakeholder for an opportunity back in 2018 and 2019 to look at environmental governance with new eyes, and also trying to tie this into what was happening at the Human Rights Council. As we may know, there's been an ongoing struggle for a number of years to have the right to a clean environment as a right, and this was adopted earlier this year. But back in 2019, after deliberations and work, and with some passionate support from the EU, a technical and evidence-based report that identified and assessed possible gaps in international environmental law and environment-related instruments with a view to strengthening their implementation was given to the UN. And as I said earlier, there is an active NGO participation in this process. Next slide, please. So the UN General Assembly now picks this up and has a discussion on it and adopts the General Assembly Resolution 73333. And it has, of course, always a very succinct and short title. It's called simply Follow-up to the Report of the Ad Hoc Open-Ended Working Group established pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 72277. And for those who work with us, they just simply refer to the 333 resolution. Now, this has now become a General Assembly resolution. And the General Assembly then gives UNEP and the UNEA kind of the job to further develop this. It's in the resolution that UNEA is going to pursue these issues. And as we see in the next slide, I think if I remember correctly, members of the Bureau of the UN Environment Assembly, the UNEA, and of the CPR jointly agreed on a way forward regarding the follow-up on the UN General Assembly Resolution 7333. Now, there are two people now actively involved. It's Sakline Saida from Pakistan and Nada Lomus from Estonia. And these are driving forces in now trying to develop this resolution into something which is tangible. Now, there is an interesting problem here because of the formalities of the UN. And I think that may come up in the next slide if my memory serves me right. That may be wrong, of course, but let's see. Yes. Slowly emerging from internet and into our screens, we will see that the CPR and the Bureau of UNEA actually says the following. They forwarded these recommendations to the UN Environment Assembly for its consideration. This is also text from the General Assembly resolution to prepare at its fifth session. This is the fifth session we're in February 2021, a political declaration for a United Nations high-level meeting subject to voluntary funding, etc., or as they say here, it could be also maybe discussed at the Stockholm +50 meeting in June of 2022. Now they ended up with giving this to the special session, which will be held back to back to UNEA 5.2, the special session on UNEP 50. Hoping that the meeting, the special session, which also has the line in the mandate for the special session, at the highest possible level, and at the highest possible level means heads of state. Now, whether that will pan out, we don't know yet. But the 7333 resolution on environmental governance and law is now hopefully going to be part of the outcome, negotiated outcome from the special session. It's intended to be so, but there is again this problem between UNEA and the General Assembly, because the General Assembly Second Committee has not yet gavelled the decision, saying that we give the mandate to the special session in March next year to pursue this and end up with a negotiated resolution. But this is a step forward for strengthening environmental law and governance. And there are also member states, including with the support of civil society, to look at what the UPR process at the Human Rights Council is doing in looking at how environmental law is being monitored. So we may see that this is now coming into a new phase. And they also talk about using the Montevideo program, as we see here, we've listed this, because this also then will give both technical and financial help to developing countries. One idea is also to establish a liaison office in Nairobi, so better connect CSO on both sides of the Atlantic and with Geneva to pursue these issues strongly. We'll see. This is an interesting development. It says here in the headline, UNEP at 50 or Stockholm plus 50. Well, the idea and the wish is to have it as a ministerial outcome element from UNEP at 50, because, as I said, it's thought that this meeting is slightly more important, our bigger political status, than what's happening in Stockholm. Whether that is true or not, next year will give us an understanding of future actions, also of discussion, and this is pushed also hard. It's crucial for having a level playing field to take actions on environmental challenges reasonably seriously. And the interesting thing here is that in working on the 7333 and the follow-up and the discussion around a level playing field, the private sector has been very active. They said it's much better for us to know what to do and what not to do than just look at voluntary actions and voluntary predicaments and then try to find our way through it and end up most probably being criticized by non-state stakeholders. If we can sort of set things in stone, then it's easy for us to act towards it. And of course, you have the other issues, the horizontal governance and political leadership, condition for achieving progress on this, and then aligning this with other negotiations, which is going on the convention. And here they also look at what's happening with the Aichi goals, although that is tangential to this. But the focus on the 7333 is to strengthen the environmental law and governance. And whether or not this will be decided on in the special session or pushed towards the Stockholm meeting in June or into the General Assembly this fall, the next fall, that remains to be seen. Thank you.
So thank you very much. That brings us to the question and answer period. Felix, thank you for coming in. Gentlemen, there are no questions at the moment. Can I ask our audience, do you have any questions about the the 73/333, strengthening environmental law? While you're thinking about that, Felix, would you care to make any comments?
Yeah, I think it's a stupid resolution. But Gustav knows that. I think that I am not aware of any significant government supporting it. The EU won't support it. The Americans won't support it. The Russians, the Chinese won't support it. When it was a pact, whether it gets mentioned in some way as ways of coordinating conventions, which is what we all suggested in the first place, was a better way of going. It will not be what they originally had suggested. It already has been decreased there. And when I attended one of the NGO meetings, none of them seemed to have spoken to governments. And so that was, this is the coalition that's advocating for it. So I have a real problem with the resolution. What I do have a lot of support for is what Jan Gustav presented earlier on the medium-term strategy and what we now see as an opportunity to cluster conventions around biodiversity, chemicals, and nature. And that, I think, is a much more likely place to bear fruit. And I say that having, we will be looking at the resolutions shortly. And you'll see what I mean when we look at those resolutions that are in front of UNEA. We already have a super COP for chemicals. We have got a process under biodiversity that's moved. And then one could imagine that will come to conclusion in the next couple of years, funded by the Swiss. And then it will be good to put Montreal and climate together. And you could imagine by 2030, upgrading of UNEP to a specialized agency with a structure similar to the World Trade Organization with 3 areas that they've discussed. And that for me would be the much more that we would achieve a lot more if we approached it that way than an abstract pact. But saying that, people are putting a lot of effort into it, and so good luck on them.
Gustav, do you see any potential for the pact to develop into something that Felix and others would find more productive?
Well, it's not a pact anymore. So, and I think the people who are involved in this try to stress that the global pact is history, and we're talking about the environmental governance and law. But it remains to be seen. I mean, clearly, as Felix rather succinctly said, the development of the resolution, or the possible resolution and outcome resolution, has not been a smooth sailing. It's in a bumpy road. And added to that are the formalities, whether or not the special session will have the mandate to do so by the General Assembly or not. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see the following few days will clearly show us the direction this will be taking. And I know that a lot of the non-state stakeholders who are involved in this feels empowered and energized by the fact that the Human Rights Council now has put up that the right to a clean environment is a human right.
Well, thank you for adding a bit of clarity to Felix's colorful adjective in his thinking about the former global pact. There is a question in the Q&A box. It is this: how is this global? Which methods did UNEP use to include indigenous peoples, governance, MEAs, coordinating mechanisms in UNEP's response to the resolution?
Well, first of all, excuse me, it's a quirky road into the deliberation, because it starts out as a General Assembly resolution, and the General Assembly doesn't have any modus operandi for civil society or non-state stakeholders. ECOSOC does as a charter body. UNEP does because they have their own rules book, but the General Assembly doesn't. So it was only when the General Assembly sort of hinted or gave UNEP a working mandate to further develop this when it came into 73333. And then, as often is the case, UNEP says it's an open process, and those who are interested should now tell us that they want to be involved. And if you don't, say, I'd like to be part of this, if you're not following this, you won't get the chance. And I think UNEP, and I said this earlier, when it comes to the invitation from UNEP to all its accredited non-state stakeholders to participate in developing the medium-term strategy, the participation has been minimal or none. And this was also the case with the 7333. They opened it up, they asked for participation, and you saw those people that responded, a picture of them. There were a few others. They all came from law backgrounds and from law organizations. A couple of them are huge global networks, but this is what they got. And then UNEP says, okay, it's open, it's on our website, there is a deadline. You want to be part of it, you have to measure, you have to indicate, and that's how it's done. And I very often say to people, please read daily what's happening on these websites, because this is where you have the information.
Thank you for that, Jan Gustav. With that, I am not seeing any new questions. There was that one question came from the chat box. So if I can please remind our participants to put questions in the Q&A box, but nevertheless, we did get to answer that one. Well, in that case, why don't we move on to the next section? Now, I will say to both Felix and Jan Gustav, we are running a bit behind schedule in that we have, we're not overrunning. And this is a pretty long section. So I would say you have, pardon me, some flexibility of maybe going a little bit longer on this than you initially thought you would. So I'm going to give it over to Jan Gustav first.
Thank you. So the next slide. A central theme for the UNEA 5 was and still is strengthening actions for nature to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this is an interesting title to me because it represents a compromise where actually the initial idea from the Bureau and the CPR is not as good. The CPR and the Bureau wanted to have nature-based solutions as not only the guiding title for UNEA 5, but the key title. But there was political opposition, especially coming from G77, saying it's too radical, it's too difficult to have it, it is not what we want. So there was negotiating back and forth, and they came up with strengthening actions for nature to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as a compromise title. Again, this goes back to what we said earlier, that it's the Bureau and the CPR that proposes the titles, but it's in the end, of course, the universal body, the UNEA, that decides. So this is what we're talking about. Next slide, please. Again, a reminder, when we come to the documents that are prepared by any of the UN bodies, and in this case by UNEP or UNEA, they build on a lot of reports. I refer to two important reports that I know has inspired the writing of several documents. It's the GSDR, the Global Sustainable Development Report, produced by a body of independent scientists and published in 2019. It is, of course, also the environmental element of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, and not the least, the IPBES report on biodiversity loss, etc. And these are just three of many reports that underpin a lot of the basic documents. So the titles of the resolutions often reflect background issues with member states, but they also reflect what is the current issue in environmental challenges of the world. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, UNEA 5.1 made three procedural decisions. It decided on the MTS, it endorsed the management of trust funds and earmarked contributions and the budget, and agreed to convene and resume in-person UNEA 5.2 on the 28th of February and March 1 and 2. Next slide, please. And they hope this is going to be, we see people in the seats again negotiating. The importance of these decisions taken in February this year was that it allowed UNEP to continue its work as an organization, including strengthening environmental dimensions of the 2030 Agenda, and a lot of other stuff that we'll come back to. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. But of course, these were the three major decisions, as I said earlier, but it also agreed to a number of other things. It endorsed the statement entitled Looking Ahead to the Resumed UNEA in 2022, messages from the online UNEA 5.1, highlighting the three environmental crises, which we talked about as the basis for the MTS, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And it launched a commemoration of UNEP 50 and Stockholm plus 50, both conferences to take place next year. Next slide, please. Because in addition to all these sort of major decisions made by UNEP, it went into a number of sort of between the lines decisions. Continue joint efforts to strengthen actions across nature for the SDGs, relevant mandates coming from earlier sessions, progress reports by the executive director of UNEP submitted to UNEA, and we'll see that, and this re-emerges in UNEA 5.2 because this is when actions and further development on this take place. We had a discussion last year on 7333, as we talked about. It decided on the modalities of UNEA 5.2, as you see, plenary meetings, sessional committee of the whole, high-level segment, leadership dialogues, and a multi-stakeholder dialogue. This was also decided last February. Encourages member states to submit draft resolution for consideration. There is a deadline right now, but they also said that, please hand in your resolutions, proposed resolutions, no later than 2 weeks before Christmas. That is very close. They need time to sort of digest all of these things. Whether that will be the case based on earlier experience, probably not. And they decide to convene a special session on the UNEA to commemorate the 50th anniversary on March 3 and 4. Next slide, please. So lots of decisions were made sort of between the lines, not the big sort of monumental decisions where you require a quorum, but these come into this as an element. And are we getting the next slide? Yes. So the theme of the leadership dialogues, contribution of the environmental dimension of sustainable development to building a resilient and inclusive, oops, that was a bit too fast. Can we go back? Because if you have the time, and I know this is a lot of reading material, but you can scan through it. And if you could, we highlighted this in our synthesis report, which is on Stakeholder Forum's website, but you can also go to the Earth Negotiation Bulletin, which has a very good update and summary of what took place in the dialogues, because the dialogues actually, in an interesting way, showed what the different countries and member states actually focus on. Lots of talk about the of COVID-19 pandemic, green recovery, etc. But it's worth looking at because these thoughts and ideas will be brought into the UNEA we're going to go into in a few weeks. Next now, please. What we're coming into here, I think, if I remember correctly, the next slide, yes. Thematic reports to be dealt with during UNEA 5.2. And this is also a basis for resolution work. The executive director and the secretariat is charged to report progress on earlier decisions. They're charged to look at upcoming problems with the environment, etc. And so through discussions, they have now decided and agreed to 21 different themes. And there will be reports on this, and they're already, some of them are already out, and it's very good reading if you're interested in these things in an environmental context. And again, if you go back to the synthesis report we made on the outcome of UNEA 5.1, you'll see the reference here, so it's easily accessible on the website. But just to repeat, pathways to achieve sustainable consumption production comes up, solution for curbing food loss, challenges through sustainable business practice, sustainable infrastructure, microplastics, chemicals, biodiversity and land degradation, rangelands and pastoralism, gender equality, poverty environment nexus, mineral resource governance, and there are a few more on the next slide, please. And what's important is this will be part of the discussion in the upcoming UNEA 5.2. I'm getting the next slide slowly, I hope. Because it just ends the summary of these 21 themes. Support of implementation of the 5th program for the development of periodic review of environmental law. Oops, that was a bit too fast again. Charles, can you go back again, please? Just go through this. I'm soon through. Go back. No. We're not coming back. Yeah, so the Global Environmental Outlook, as you see, which is a very well worth reading document and downloading it because they do analyze the trends on challenges to environmental stability. You have the contribution to HLPF, soil pollution, water pollution, illegal trade in wildlife, progress on past program of work, POW, and medium-term strategies. And then, as I said, all of these themes, the 21 themes, have basic information documents to back it up with, and worth reading, worth looking at, because they say something about UNEP. Now we can go to the next one. So the following few slides is what the Secretariat, with the support of the two bureaus, would like to see inside events, and also hopefully to energize the discussions in the Committee of the Whole and in the subcommittee meetings. Let's see what they say. Next slide. Because they are, I think they're quite ambitious, trying to put together the vision to accelerate and have breakthroughs and to connect. Progress and key initiatives, secure breakthroughs on a couple of initiatives around UNEA's theme, and to connect UNEA to the world and the world to UNEA. Very important. The outreach here is important. Next one, because they really have sort of made the plan. And then the objective is to secure policy progress and action, create a global news headline, narrative coherence, and high-level attendance, virtual or in person, because this is most probably going to be a hybrid meeting. Well, these are some of the ambitions that I hope they can infuse into the discussions, including the deliberations. Next slide. And key themes to be covered. They talk about nature of jobs, poverty eradication, and economic prosperity, not necessarily in the key deliberations, but at least deal with this and the side events. Building back better, ecosystem restoration, very important because we have a decade on that. Nature for human ecosystem health, investing in nature, the opportunity, One Health. Global agreement on marine plastics, Felix will come back to that. And the opportunity here is to see systemic change. Very ambitious visions that the Secretariat has, and with the support of the bureaus. So we'll see if that also transpires into what the deliberations will be like. Next slide, please. Nature for climate, action to match commitments, and the opportunity, climate resilience. Of course, here they will be taking cognizance for what happened in Glasgow. And sustainable food systems, reduce agricultural impact on nature, and the opportunities to see nourished people and in equitable livelihoods. Maybe, at least this is what they hope shall be elements to be thought about when we are deliberating our agendas. Next slide, please. And then they say, what about the upcoming discussions? Digital transformation, where do we put that? We know there will be a youth forum. They want to support that, building out a bigger youth education vision. And then the Science Policy Business Forum will take place. Will that make sense to the rest of the deliberations? And the report outputs, providing targeted and timely information to support decisions at UNEA. This is where accountability, this is where governance element comes in. All of this has been discussed, all of this has been drawn up and discussed by the bureaus and the Secretariat, and they hope this will maybe engender a change. Next, please. So, excuse me, out of the existing roadmaps, and the roadmap is quite detailed because they also look at tangential meetings and parallel meetings that can inspire what's going on. These are some of the dates. We don't have to go through them, but this is for you to see. I mean, you have a continuation of meetings between the CPR and the bureaus. And then, of course, the 28th of February on 2022, UNEA 5.2 opens. But mind you, before that, you have the OACPR deliberating what should be taking place and preparing decisions. So this is a rough roadmap with themes and agenda already in the pipeline and will be discussed. And the next one is a bit more of an interest because this one in the keep it, don't take the next one, but this one, including the next one, sort of on top of each other, because this is the outline of the resumed session of UNEA 5.1 from February 28 to March 1, then the high-level segment and the special session of UNEP at 50. And this is basically the agenda and the timeline. And you see that on Monday, you will have regional bureau meetings very early, then you have the opening plenary, and then you have the president, the executive director statements, major groups opening, excuse me, opening statements, and then at 11:30 you go into national statements, and then these mornings, the following mornings, you have the Committee of the Whole on Tuesday, National Statement on Tuesday, Wednesday, high-level segment opening, plenaries, and then discussion. And then on Thursday and Friday, 3-4 March, you go into the special session on the UNEP 50. And can I have the next slide, please? This is then the afternoon and evening, and these are the same dates, of course. The Committee of the Whole will begin its work on Monday, parallel to national statements, and then the Committee of the Whole will then probably hopefully finish up what it should be doing, getting input from all the subcommittees, and then parallel to that on Tuesday, you have leadership dialogues with MEAs and multi-stakeholder dialogues as well. And then parallel to that, as you see on Wednesday, you have the closing plenary of UNEA 5. And then you have actually, hopefully, a host reception where everybody say, well done. And then you go into the continuation of UNEP 50. The agenda for UNEP 50 is not yet decided. It will be coming out, I think, shortly. And also some of the aspirations that are put into the outcome from UNEP 50, whether this is just going to be commemoration or whether this is going to be an aspirational document that sort of brings UNEP into the next 50 years or so. We don't know. I know that stakeholders, non-state stakeholders, are working on a very interesting report called the UNEP We Want, which will be presented during these. So UNEP has been good with the support of member states to involve a process with the non-state stakeholders working independently to look at these with critical eyes. Next slide, please.
I think this is me now.
And now I give the floor to Felix.
You're suffering a little bit, Jan Gustav.
I know, I'm clogging up with my cold.
Yeah, you need to get some Lemsip or something to get better.
I know, but then it's not sold in Norway, unfortunately. So you should send me something.
Okay, I'll see what I can do.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do, and I thank Jan Gustav for explaining all of that. And I think at this particular point, we have a number of resolutions that have gone to the Committee of Permanent Representatives in October. Some of them have got links, so you'll be able to go from these slides to the relevant resolutions very easily once you get the information. So the first two resolutions deal with the issue of whether or not we're establishing an intergovernmental negotiating committee on plastics. And there's a little bit, we'll go into plastics a little bit more after these resolutions, but just to distinguish between these two resolutions. The first one is one which looks at reducing the discharge of plastics into the environment by covering all stages of the plastic life cycle by adopting a circular economy. So it's really dealing with plastics in a much more holistic approach. The second one, which has been suggested by Japan, is really more focusing on marine plastic pollution. So you could imagine these two will be amalgamated at some particular point. And it's quite interesting to see that big brands and retailers who have been criticized most recently for their plastic packaging use are at the moment on course to reduce their virgin plastic use by a fifth by 2025. So that's a major development, and that's in a report by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who've been one of the key organizations advocating for a plastics convention. The draft resolution from Sri Lanka dealing with sustainable nitrogen management is to try and set up something between all of the relevant conventions, an inter-convention coordinating mechanism to show that nitrogens are being addressed effectively in the relevant conventions and to, in a sense, ensure that if there are gaps, that those are addressed. The resolution by Indonesia on sustainable lake management looks to bring together research and scientific guidance and science policy interlinkages in a way that's being addressed around lakes. That's not been done before. The resolution on mineral resource governance is actually really important. There's not been any existing really proper intergovernmental process that's dealt with issues like mining, and so that's been done much more on a voluntary basis, and so there's fragmentation of bits of mining that's being dealt with, like under the Mercury Convention. This is an opportunity to bring that together and to see whether or not there should be a legally binding agreement that addresses this in the future. If you could have the next slide, that would be really good. If I could, Charles. That's very kind. See, it took a little while to come up on my thing. So Switzerland's looking at a draft resolution on sound management of chemicals and waste, and that's because there's been a process since the World Summit on Sustainable Development. They've had a number of international conferences on chemical management. The fifth one will take place just before the meeting at UNEA, and there's an attempt to look at how it is a unique area that a new unique approach that they have there, where they engage stakeholders in the governing body of CICA. And so they're looking at taking that process, which was meant to have finished in 2020, up to 2030. And so that will be what that resolution will deal with. The resolution that's looking at a science policy panel on chemicals, waste and pollution, in a sense, says it all. We have IPBES around biodiversity. We have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This would then deal with that third one. And if you remember the three areas that UNEP want to work on: chemicals, biodiversity and climate, and that underpinning UNEP is having it be an advocate for good science. This makes sense. Then the issue will be, of course, the coordination between these science bodies. The final one that we have any information about is, or the final two, is one on nature-based solutions. So that's addressing what the major theme that we're dealing with for UNEA 5, and it will look at how to prevent further increase in risks connected to climate change, biodiversity loss, urbanization. And so it will fit into the conversation both from the Biodiversity Convention, which will have its second meeting after this, because it had a split convention meeting, and the addressing of nature-based solutions in the climate process, and then finally also in the context of marine areas. So bringing that all together will be part of what they're hoping to do. And then the final one that we have anything in a sense available for us to look at is the EU one on accelerating adaptive measures to secure water quality and strengthening climate resilience in aquatic ecosystems. So within the UN system, there is no body that deals with water. There's an interagency body called UN Water, which brings together the different agencies. And it would be fair to say that UNEP hasn't done much on water in recent years. And so this is an opportunity to bring together, in a sense, the whole of the aquatic ecosystem and to look at climate change. Look at the next slide, please. Then there's a series of concept notes that haven't yet appeared. So we don't yet have a draft resolution on green economy or draft resolution on circular economy. We don't have one on biodiversity and health. We don't have one on animal welfare. And you saw animal welfare being brought up. Now, that one of the issues in the presentation that Jan Gustav made, one of the issues is how much of this is being done and discussed with the Food and Agriculture Organization. And so it's quite critical that when UNEP starts to do activities that have relevance to other UN agencies, that those UN agencies are part of that discussion and actually help to frame the discussion. And one on forests, financial mechanisms for forest ecosystems and biodiversity. And that was one of the side issues at the climate change convention meeting, and will be an issue at the biodiversity convention meeting that will come up in May, the second part of it. And so this is an opportunity to make some conversations about that prior to that happening. It was also a conversation that happened around the Food Systems Summit as well. So this is an area on agriculture, very controversial in the climate change, but an opportunity to start to link together different process. And then clearly Russia's not very happy about the representation from the Eastern Bloc in the context of staffing within UNEP. So they will raise that as an issue. If you could move to the next slide, Charles. So just giving you a little bit of a background on how we've got to the setting up a potential convention on plastics. I mean, one could go back to, I think, UNEA 3, which set in motion a process, which then in 4 set up a working group. And then what we saw in Geneva from the 30th of August to the 2nd of September was an extremely well-run process by a number of governments to line up the possibility for conventions. If we could have the next slide. And this is a video which, Charles, you need to explain how people are going to watch it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what we found is we can't quite explain why the embedded video isn't working. So I've just put the link into the chat box. I think the logical thing would be, Felix, to have our guests watch it, save it and watch it perhaps at another time.
No, I don't agree. I think they should watch it now. That's what, otherwise you can't move on to the next thing.
Well, I understand that it's a little bit of uncertainty about what it might do to their various platforms, but we can do that. It is it's quite brief. So why don't the participants try to watch it now on their various platforms or tablets or computers, and put some comments in the chat box if there's any issues. So we'll give you a few moments to do that. Felix, do you recall how long that video is?
Just finished the movie.
Charles, you could move it on to the next slide.
Okay. Okay, Felix, and to our guests, thank you for your patience there. Apologies for the technical glitch. We will get that corrected. In the meantime, Felix, thank you, and you could please move on.
Yeah, I'm just repeating what I said earlier. We had UNEA 3 in December 2017 that established the ad hoc open-ended expert group on marine litter. And then we had that group have 4 meetings between May 18 and December 2018, November 2019, and November 2020. So a lot of time to take in how it's developing and to, in a sense, address any of the concerns and have bilateral meetings as well as those multilateral ones. UNEA 4 didn't significantly move the
pardon me, Felix, you're dropping out a little bit again. Maybe take your video off for a few minutes and then we'll come back to you in a moment.
Well, no, I mean, I'll just leave it off.
Okay.
So in March 2019, continue the process in November 2020. If you could move to the next slide. So there was a group of countries that got together, Ecuador,
Germany, Ghana, Vietnam. So you can see that they've brought together 4 of the UN regions with a country representing that so that that country can, in a sense, build support within that region. It's not an unusual way of approaching moving forward on any either resolution or on any process. It shows you are not doing it as a developed country approach, but as a coordinated approach.
They held a conference or process on marine litter and plastic pollution under the auspices of UNEP. They did their preparatory meeting in May this year, and then they held the ministerial conference in September with active involvement of stakeholders in both of those meetings and a universal push even from the industry groups to support the process to move to an intergovernmental negotiating committee. If we could move to the next slide. So the Ministerial Declaration, which is available from the UNEP website or from their website, it has a common goal, vision and objectives of any potential global instrument. So what they're doing, this is true for any MEA, as they're indicating what the core elements of the MEA would be. And it's likely that the development of this MEA will be what they will call a framework convention, just like you have for biodiversity and climate. So it may not have targets in it. It may be just creating the narrative. And that narrative would also have to say what data was to be collected, what monitoring process would have to happen, what reporting process. Would it be annually? Would it be biannually? That kind of things. It would address measures to address marine litter, and they argued in this that it should be through a life cycle approach, and that approach should be in dialogue with industry. That there should be national, regional cooperation, coordination, and implementation because plastics move across boundaries. And that there needed to be financial and technical support to enable developing countries to address this. Could you move to the slide? And then the resolution that came out, the suggestion from the ministers who signed up, and they were given, I think, 2 or 3 weeks to sign up to support this, and to support the idea of an internationally legally binding agreement. But they wanted one that was comprehensive approach to prevent and reduce plastic pollution in the environment, including microplastics. They wanted to move on to the next slide, Charles. Do you want to finish? Oh, thank you. Which was including the life cycle of plastics, and to obviously try and ensure that the production consumption and design of the use of plastics is linked into a proper waste treatment, prevention, treatment and management. And if you have the chance when you get the PowerPoints to link into particularly the Swiss resolution, you'll see that much of the ministerial suggestions from this meeting find their way into that resolution. So that's what I think will become the main omnibus resolution for dealing with plastics. Next slide. Okay, so we're at the point where you can ask questions or make comments.
Jan Gustav, if you'd be so kind to come back in, and Felix, bring your video back on. Let's see if that's working okay now. Why don't we take a look? What I will do is there's one question. I guess I have to find my my links here. There was a question, not a little bit separate from this, I'll answer it, about the deadline for side events. Now, my understanding is that deadline was the 31st of October. I don't know if it was extended. Was it extended, Jan Gustav? No.
No, not only it's been expended 3 times already, and
That's
they
correct.
closed it on the 31st October. However, as we know, there is something called the Green Tent, which is administered by the civil society, and the Green Tent is as it says, it's a tent which is established on the premises of UNEP headquarters. And this has also seats and stages and possibilities for presentations like side events, but then on the, you could say, under the auspices of civil society. And this is open, I think, until around mid-December, or even extended further. But this is open, but it's not like a side event.
Thank you, Jan Gustav.
I would say that just so people are aware that there is talk of putting a top number on how many stakeholders will be able to attend the UNEA, and this is in part because only 1% of people have been vaccinated in Kenya at the moment, and the other thing is that the rooms are actually much smaller than the climate change rooms, and so there's a limited number that you can have in the rooms just on the basis of keeping people apart from each other. So at some point they're going to have to make a decision on how many stakeholders will be able to attend, I guess that will be done at the CPR before Christmas, Jan Gustav?
I think so. The discussion will end up with the Bureau and CPR. Yes, I think this is one of the pre-Christmas meetings.
And just to add a little bit, I believe the current vaccination rate in Kenya is somewhere around 5 to 10%, but of course still, very low compared to the more developed world. And UNEP is required to, of course, follow the national rules there, and cannot do similar to what was done with Glasgow, whereas all the stakeholders were invited, but the delegations were limited to a small number of people. That's how they managed it. Alexander Uras has said that should things change, they have an open mind to expanding it a bit, but at this early stage, it's hard to say. Well, having said that, gentlemen, there are no more questions. I want to look into the chat. Just a question. It was a little comment in the chat about Mexico City having single-use plastics banned, but companies now put green biodegradable seal, even though it's not. Well, there's a lot of challenges out there to actually finding genuine sustainable solutions. Well, if there are no other questions, and if you two don't have any further comments on the pending resolutions, why don't we move on to the final section, which is on UNEP at 50 and Stockholm plus 50 on Gustav. That is your section, and I will move the slide forward for that.
Thank you, Charles. Well, UNEP at 50 and Stockholm plus 50, 2 processes, 2 commemorative events to be held next year. It's a bit of an interesting background story to it, because what I'm telling you now is gleaned from multiple internet calls. As I said earlier, in these days with internet and online meetings only available to all of us who are outside of the sort of closed meetings that delegates and member states have, reliable gossip is really hard to find. But be that as it may, based on talks with member states, both in Nairobi and in New York, and also based on extensive reading of documents, this is what I think has transpired. First of all, UNEA 4, of course, discussed the upcoming event in 2022, meaning 50 years since UNEP was established. It was one of the outcome results of the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, Human Resources back in 1972. People, delegates, member states naturally looked at Sweden because this is where the so-called Stockholm meeting was held and which then gave birth to UNEP. Well, it turned out that countries didn't want Stockholm to be Stockholm, only they said that it shouldn't be necessarily held in Stockholm. It could be held anywhere, and why not Nairobi? So without going too much into what has transpired and what I have been able to get as a gossip, the compromise of these slight oppositions to just having one meeting was to have a meeting in Nairobi, back-to-back to UNEA 5.2, and then one in June in Stockholm, celebrating the anniversary as well. Now, would there be two similar meetings or not? Well, basically, no. UNEP at 50 is going to talk about UNEP as such, the organization, challenging issues, etc. And Stockholm plus 50 in June will discuss the future and be visionary and sort of raise the stakes as much as possible. The initial idea was to have a 3-day event in Stockholm that was reduced through negotiations to 2 days. And again, one can only speculate why it was reduced to 2 days when the Swedish government actually was prepared to pay for a 3-day conference. Now, that's a very scanty background, and I think as we go into these discussions and these meetings and see they happen, we'll learn more excuse me, about this. So let's have the next slide. Just a very quick recap. 50 years will have elapsed by 2022 since the Stockholm Conference. And these are pictures from the opening conference. Took place in June in 1972. And I am always a bit, how can I say, amused by the fact that so many people within the UN system, when they write about the Stockholm meeting, said hosts of state leaders went to Stockholm for the meeting, which is not true. There were only 2 state leaders there. That was Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, naturally, and Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India. Those were the 2 only state leaders. Now, there were lots of high-ranking delegates from different countries, but the Stockholm Conference in 1972, 2 weeks conference, didn't fill the total membership of the UN because the Soviet bloc boycotted the entire meeting. The Secretary General, the Executive Director, Morris Strong, is below the panel itself, and he was the eminent person shepherding this difficult conference. We have a few months to prepare these meetings, and even though we've been speaking about it for a while, it's well to remember that the Stockholm Conference had 4 years to prepare. And the Stockholm Conference, I'll come back to that a little bit, actually broke innovative ways. But let's have the next picture. Next slide, please. Now, there's been discussions back and forth, and of course, you need formalities within the UN because you're going to have member states representing their views. And it was the first sort of serious formal decisions were done by the CPR back in December 2020, soon a year ago. And they said that UNEP at 50 will be distinctly different from, but closely related with a possible UN high-level political meeting in Stockholm. Now, they said it a possible UN high-level political meeting at that time because the two host countries for the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting, Kenya and Sweden, were negotiating a resolution, a set of resolutions to have the Stockholm meeting also as a UN meeting. What they said further in paragraph 9 was that these two meetings, while different, should be mutually reinforcing. And this mutually reinforcing, so they would not compete but complement each other, is also stated in the two final resolutions on the Stockholm meeting. Now, clearly, the UNEP 50 was a clear UNEP-run affair, whereas the Stockholm Plus 50 now became a General Assembly meeting because the Swedish and the Kenyan government wanted resolutions to be developed there. Next slide, please. UNEP 50, let's take that first, will be held in conjunction with the resumed session of UNEA 5 in February 2022, back-to-back, as I've said, as a two-day special session, but under the presidency of UNEA 6. This is the decision-taking. It will take stock of, endorse, or adopt the outcome of the consultation process under the GA Resolution 73333. At least this is the idea and the hope. But as I said earlier, this particular process is not yet authorized or gavelled by the General Assembly. And they have to do that in order for this to be a case. But in most likelihood, this is happening. Sorry, next slide, please. Now, UNEA 5.1 proposed an elaborate outreach program. And they did this in consultation with the Bureau and the CPR and member states, and of course the Secretariat, which has done a formidable job to put together a very, very ambitious program. So they wanted new flagship reports, UN UNEP Frontiers Report, Geo6 for Business, Global Waste Management Outlook, Pollution Summary Report, Protected Planet Report. So lots of work is being done to sort of focus on the challenges of environment that UNEP can take into its work. Next slide. And they presented a very, very elaborate and quite long and detailed agenda. And I just made an excerpt here to see the scope of the ambitions. Focus on UNEP's core mandates, of course, science policy interface, different but interrelated with possible UN high-level political meeting in Stockholm. This is the mutuality of these two meetings. Reinvigorate environmental multilateralism, launch the first UNEP Global Assessment Synthesis Report, UNEP 50 Communication Initiative, outreach plans, support engagement by civil society. And they're doing quite an interesting job because they are producing a report called The UNEP We Want, which is going to be presented in Nairobi on the special session. And then another rumor has it, and I have been unable to ascertain it, is that the Club of Rome, which launched back in 1972, a very dramatic report called The Limits to Growth, talking about the finite resources and the finite world we're living in, which is actually sort of foreshadowing or inspiring, take it the way you want, Rockström's planetary boundaries, and then Oxfam's donut economy, which is often superimposed to see the finite world we're living in. So these are elements that I know the Club of Rome has been working on. And one rumor has it that the Club of Rome is now updating their report and want to present this at a special session in Nairobi. The other rumor that I have, which claims as much substantial truth to it, says, no, this report will be published in Stockholm in June next year. So we'll see. There are lots of initiatives that will come into this. And then, of course, what will the high-level ministerial declaration be? And will it be really high-level at heads of state? Some initiatives point in that direction. Other initiatives point in the direction of merely or just or thankfully, environment ministers. We'll see. This is not, at least not to my mind, decided officially yet, but people are working on it. And of course, Inger Andersen, the executive director of UNEP, and her staff will really have a tough job to do. And the tailoring of flagship reports and initiatives to UNEP 50, legacy publication, will be very interesting, because this will build up the global assessment dialogue and ongoing work on enhanced environmental governance. And we get the governance back again. So this may relate very well to the 73333 and the fact that the Human Rights Council actually now is focused on this. Next slide, please. Then let's go to Stockholm plus 50. And I think it's important that these two events do not compete with each other. This is now decided to be on June 2nd and June 3rd in 2022. And can I have the next slide, please? Just to repeat, there is a legacy worth remembering that was actually developed, identified and developed and presented to the world in 1972. First of all, the Stockholm Conference put the environment firmly on the global agenda. There's no question about it. Now, the global environmental issues, it was not the first time that it was discussed in Stockholm. Just prior to this, UNESCO had launched its Man and Biosphere program. And as early as in the 1950s, the World Meteorological Organization, which is a specialized agency of the UN, began atmospheric and measurements and soil pollution rising. So the environment was already discussed, but not in a broad sense as it became in Stockholm. It was definitely also the beginning of environmental governance. It was the first time civil society was allowed to address an official plenary at a multilateral conference on a regular basis. They reported, they had an NGO conference parallel to the official conference, and they reported from the NGO conference to the plenary on a regular daily basis. This is partly because Maurice Strong, the Canadian Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference, with the strong support of Olof Palme, the Swedish Premier, who's pictured here, wanted this to be the case. And of course, the fact that civil society, non-state stakeholders, was given this space at an official multilateral conference changed all subsequent UN meetings. Environmental law was given an institutional home, definitely. And some claims that this was also the beginning of environmental diplomacy. And I should have added science across, on a horizontal basis, across institutions, environmental science. The Stockholm meeting was the first time country assessments were presented. This is one of the things that the Swedish government and the Secretariat, with the support of the UN, actually used to get countries to come. 80 national reports on the state of the environment were presented in 1972 to the Stockholm Conference. And this was sort of a trendsetter. And when we say that voluntary national reports are being presented at HLPF, and we think this is a novelty, or we thought it was a novelty in 2016, it wasn't, because it was the first time country assessments were made was back in 1972. Now, there was another consistent and cohesive system, so it wasn't easily comparable. It was not on the same basis, or same standard, but it began back then. So next slide, please. So the Stockholm Plus 50 mandate has two resolutions: an enabling resolution, which was agreed to in May 24, and a modalities resolution on September the 10th. But both of these, actually, I would say, from what I thought would be the case a year ago, has limited the ambitions. And this is my interpretation. Now, Inger Andersen, the executive director of UNEP, has been appointed by Guterres as the Secretary General of the conference in Stockholm, which gives UNEP a position which is very strong. At the same time, these two resolutions does not talk about the meeting as a UN high-level meeting. They talk about it as an international meeting. And I keep thinking that whenever member states do not want to be serious about something, they reduce the ambition in a resolution to a high-level international meeting. They did that repeatedly in water issues 10 years ago. So having no access to reliable gossip, this is what got into my mind. But UNEP is to serve as a focal point, providing support with appropriate support from the Secretariat and other relevant entities. There were generic themes identified, and the overarching theme of the Stockholm meeting is a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity. There's a strong focus on implementation. Mentalities resolution talked about leadership dialogues and plenaries. Each leadership dialogue is presided by 2 chairs, and they'll give you the title of these. And there will be concept notes, etc., etc. But the outcome is not going to be negotiated. It's going to be a summary of discussions. Next slide, please. So there's infused a lot of energy into this now as of late. I just wanted to see this picture because I think it speaks history. This is Indira Gandhi speaking with Maurice Strong in Stockholm. And I think she was courageous. The only person, the only state leader that said, this is important for me, I'll go to Stockholm. But they want to, the UN, the Swedes and Kenyans and the member states having worked on this, say we want to have this conference at an intergenerational responsibility. We will see it as an implementing opportunity. It needs to be interconnected and it needs to be inclusive. Next, please. The themes discussed by stakeholders, because slowly the non-state stakeholders have been getting interested in this. And so they have come up with a number of issues to be discussed. The 333 on environmental governance and law has come up through the legal systems, networks of NGOs doing this. Ecocide, interlegal instrument, is another one. Olof Palme, when he had a 20-minute intervention in Stockholm, he talked about Agent Orange, which was the chemical used by the American forces in Vietnam in the Vietnamese War to defoil the trees in the jungles of Vietnam. It was a massive cancerous agent, and it caused horrible damage to people, Americans and Vietnamese alike. And he talked about the ecocide issue. And this has now been picked up as a possibility to say, maybe we should do this. Maybe we should develop the ecocide into a legal instrument. And this has caught on a lot of interest around the world. Strengthening environmental law, both in connection with 73333, but also as an independent position. And of course, strengthening UNEP. And Felix mentioned this earlier, and I will repeat it again. Maybe we should be talking about giving UNEP the status of a specialized agency again. We discussed it in RIA plus 20. The compromise was UNEA with universal membership, but we're not there yet. And the youth are also making strides to have, they say we want to make UNEP and the environment shine again, and they have a coalition of willing supporters working really hard to make this a very festive and strong conference. Next slide, please. So pathways towards a healthy planet for the prosperity of all. The identified leadership dialogues are to the left, and then what they hope to find out and come out of it, some of the ideas to the right. Leadership Dialogue 1, reflecting on the urgent need for actions to achieve a healthy planet and prosperity of all. 2, achieving a sustainable and inclusive recovery from the COVID pandemic. 3, accelerating the implementation of the environmental dimension of sustainable development in the context of the decade of action. My mind says this is not really challenging issues. And another thing which I felt I was very sorry about when I saw the resolution, they sort of take this away from the focus of what UNEP is supposed to do, dealing with the environment. They've come up with 5 R's. This idea probably was inspired maybe by the 5 P's of the 2030 agenda, but they talk about regeneration, recovery, rebalance, renewal, and reimagine. And there is ambitions here, but I think it's up to civil society and non-state stakeholders to lift the energy, infuse the energy, and come out with something which is really inspiring, because it would be a waste of an opportunity if we only come up with a bland statement, which is a summary of discussions. So we have some challenge ahead. We have an opportunity And there is a possibility, and I agree with you, to make UNEP and the environment shine again. One more slide, or maybe this was, yes. So this is a roadmap to Stockholm, which is outlined. I'm not going into details. You can have this later, but this is what we expect to happen. And as again I said, unfortunately, we're in mid-November 2021. The conference will happen on the 2nd and 3rd of June, which is Thursday and a Friday. And then the the International Environment Day is on the Sunday following that. But then the conference is over. But we don't have much time to make this really, a substantive conference, but we can. And I think we should support the Swedish and Kenyan governments in their efforts to make this, a pivotal moment in time. Thank you. So the summary of the outcomes here: recommendations that contribute to an environmental dimension of sustainable development, accelerate implementation of commitments in the context of Decade of Action, sustainable recovery, I would say, and add environment. And unfortunately, I would say, just a summary of the discussions held during the international meeting presented by its two presidents. One thing which is then important is that we, as civil society and non-state stakeholders and major groups, must make sure that all the statements coming from the non-state stakeholders working on this have their agreed statements annexed to this official report. The UN has done that many, many times before, and this can be done again. And I think that would be, since we're only talking about a document as the outcome, a summary of statements, I think this could be done. And this is where we can raise the bar to something which is very ambitious and very courageous. Thank you, Charles. I think this was the last slide.
Yes, thank you, Jan Gustav. That was a lot of information, tremendously helpful. I hope our participants found it meaningful and useful. We'll, of course, be sharing all the PowerPoints with them. So now, why don't we see if there are any questions. I'll, again, encourage our participants to ask questions in the Q&A. There are no questions at the moment. I would say, again, try not to be shy if there are questions. But in the meantime, I'll keep an eye on that. Why don't we do a little bit of wrap up? Felix, why don't you take on that first while Jan Gustav gets his voice back a little bit, and then I'll keep an eye on questions.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of comments. Kenya is also co-sponsoring with Portugal a conference on the blue economy at the beginning of July. They may have other interests. And
Felix, you're breaking up again. Maybe turn your video off. Jan Gustav, you want to? Oh, he's back. Okay. Yeah, Felix, you're breaking up again, unfortunately. Jan Gustav, why don't you? Here we go. Okay, Felix, you're back with us. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I was saying, I think the opportunity of UNEP plus 50 stakeholders, the opportunity to try and look at where the next where UNEP should be in the future, as does UNEP plus 50. So we can get a coherent message through both UNEP plus 50 and Stockholm plus 50. I think that would be useful. I'm not sure yet that we're there. I'm not sure that the stakeholders have got a clear enough idea what they want out of that. But there is still time. I mean, that's both of those events that doing these events that we're doing in the different regions will inspire more of you to engage in those discussions and to put with your ideas about what you know be addressing in the future. I'm not sure that
Felix, we've lost you again. So perhaps when you do hear this, disable your video to help with the bandwidth. Jan Gustav, while he's paused, do you want to say a few words?
For fear of repeating myself, I saw that Richard Jordan made a comment saying that make sure that it's a series of statements coming from civil society, but substantive input, and make sure that it is annexed to the official report. And I totally agree with you, Richard. We have to have that at least. And Felix, we just lost you when you said, "I'm afraid," and then I think the world wants to know what you're afraid of. Oops, you're muted.
I'm afraid of heights. I don't like heights.
Felix, you want to pick up where you were?
No, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, we do have, there's a question in there. Here we go. Can you talk about how a UNEA 5.2 meeting will work from a civil society major group's perspective in a hybrid mode? How will remote participants interact with in-person reps from civil society and government? Well,
I can go quickly. First of all, the elected major groups and facilitating committee consisting of 2 representatives from each of the 9 major groups are working on this and trying to, with UNEP Civil Society Unit, find out how they can do this, the modalities of this. In all likelihood, these people will be invited to come. And of course, meetings using the green tent will, I suppose, be supplied with widescreen so that one can have in real time connections with the world. But this will all be, just mind you, on Kenya time. So as we have now adapted our 6 presentations to the time zones, we have to adapt to the Kenyan time zone when this happens. But these modalities are being discussed. I know that, but I don't know when they will be finalized, but they will have to be finalized so that we can have a sensible connection with this.
Thank you, Jan Gustav. Let's see, there's something in the chat now. No, okay, that's not a question. It looks like there might be, no, that was it. There was the one question. So I would say if there are no further questions from our audience, Jan Gustav and Felix, do you want to each have one final comment before I wrap things up?
As I always say, we must be hopeful and be engaged, I mean, since you allow me to use the audience ears, maybe they're tired, but I was in Stockholm in 1972. I've just revealed my age, but I can, as a historian, easily trace development in a positive direction from that date. But, I keep saying that as a historian, I would say we've come a long way in a very short period of time. But as an environmentalist, we haven't come far enough. And I think Glasgow clearly demonstrated that we need to go further. So even if John Kerr said very, very nicely that Paris set the stage and Glasgow starts the race, let's just hope that we can get to the finishing line in time. But let's use all the opportunities, and Stockholm Plus 50 and UNEP at 50 and UNEAs are important issues, and that there are important events, and we can use them because as of now, they are still open and they're still fairly transparent, but we need to be there. Thank you.
I mean, I kind of look at Glasgow in a different way. So if you think that before Paris and between Copenhagen and Paris, we were on a 4 to 6 degree trajectory. After Paris, we were on a under 4 degrees trajectory, which came down to about 2.7 or to 3. After Glasgow, the trajectory is 1.8 to 2.4. And if you think that that's a 10-year period where we've pulled the curve down from 6 degrees to 1.8 to 2.4, and that it's really, and that we, instead of leaving it for 5 years to check whether people are doing what they're saying, but well, we're asking for increased contributions by next year as opposed to waiting 5 years. I think that it's really been an amazing achievement. And I think that as the dust settles, and I was extremely critical of Glasgow before, and I think the British were helped enormously by John Kerry in helping get. There will be a lot of eyes on India and China, as we mentioned earlier. There will be an issue around whether we've finally by next year hit the 100 billion, but you know, Glasgow will be looked at, I think, just like Copenhagen in retrospect, as much more of a success than people thought at the time.
Well, thanks to both of you for those closing comments. I'll just say a few words now, and then we will begin to wrap things up. I'll share our screen again so that we can share our contact details with everyone. And in particular, many thanks to all of those of you joining us here in the North American region, and in particular to the Environment Program for their cooperation and contributions for this webinar. Also, a big thanks to Jan Gustav and Felix for delivering today's rich content, and in particular, both of them who seem to be suffering a little bit from, from colds, and thankfully just something as simple as the common cold, considering what we've been through for the past 18 months. But thank you for struggling through, and I certainly hope the next time I see both of you, you're feeling better. And as mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded, and that recording by way of a link to the Stakeholder Forum YouTube page and a copy of the presentation will be posted on the Stakeholder Forum website during the next 24 hours, but also in one day, 24 hours from the start of this event, you will get an automated email from the Zoom platform with that link and other information. And lastly, a short survey will pop up when you log out of the webinar. Please take a few moments to complete it. In particular, there's a question about what else would you like to see in the future from us in terms of training or various subjects. One thing I'd ask you to consider is the brief tutorial that we gave to you on the various platforms for events. We might consider doing a more detailed, dig deeper option for doing that for a different audience in the future. So that's one thing to ask, is that something that you might find to be helpful? With that, I'll say goodbye. Thank you all, and good health to you all.